All right, good morning, friends. We will start with some C# things for function pointers. I don't know who wants to talk to you, who wants to talk to you. Who wants to talk about it is either Tanner or Fred. Fred, do you want to give us
I
an
can talk
overview?
about it. I can talk about it. Are you gonna stream the proposal email?
Oh,
Or
sorry, like it's on YouTube, it's not here. Like, let me just quickly open the sharing tray, find the right window. And of course, Teams minimizes again.
of
Here we
course.
go. All right.
So basically, there's a couple of pieces to this. Runtime and the compiler have sat down and we worked out basically a API for allowing extensible calling conventions. So today, when you encounter a calling convention, or when you encounter a method signature in IL, you have basically the call kind bit is what describes the calling convention. So we have defaults, which is a managed function, normal CLR, and then we have a whole bunch of unmanaged calling conventions. We have cdecl, stdcall, thiscall, and fastcall. The new one that we want to end var args, but we're not really talking about var args right now. The new one we want to add is called unmanaged. And this means a few different things depending on context. So if unmanaged tells the runtime, look at the set of modops that immediately follow the parameter count in IL. If those modops are of a specific type, they come from system.runtime.compiler services, and they start with the name callconv. Today we have in this namespace. Today we have types for callconv cdecl, callconv stdcall, callconv fastcall, callconv thiscall. Those have existed in the framework since .NET Framework 1.0. So look at those set of modops and take the combination of them, and that's the calling convention to use. And so this will allow the runtime to add things in the future, like, for example, vector call, without having to change the calling convention bit because we don't have that much space. And it will also allow the runtime to add things like suppress GC transition to act as a part of the calling convention. Something that should be considered in the type system of C# when we're talking about function pointers, because a function that actually has suppressed GC transition on it shouldn't be converted to one that shouldn't be converted to a function pointer that doesn't have that transition on it, because it might expect things to be that way or not, and then same for vice versa. And if there are no calling conventions, so going back to the modops, if there are no calling convention modops in that set, then the runtime will interpret this bit as use whatever the default is. So on Linux, I believe it will use cdecl, and then on Windows, stdcall. Basically, whatever the C++ compiler would actually emit normally if you don't specify anything for that platform. Yeah, so that's what this bit is going to represent. And then we need to add it to srm.signature calling convention so the compiler can actually emit this bit.
I think that part makes sense to me. So like you said earlier something about modops and combinations, but where does that stuff live? Because this is just adding this bit to the enum that is part of the metadata.
So those are required to come from the specific namespace, system.runtime.compiler services. They're required to start with callconv, and they are required to come from the core library of the application, meaning the library that defines system.object and references no other libraries.
I see.
We've already moved. So .NET Framework, this is fine. Everything's in MS Core Lib. .NET Core prior to 2.0 doesn't have these types at all.
Right.
.NET Core 2.0 added the 4 types that existed in Framework, and they added them to system.runtime, not system private core lib. But we are basically special casing in the compiler the 4 the four types that existed always as we're not even going to look up the types. We're just going to recognize that cdecl, stdcall, dyscall, and fastcall are valid things. And then for .NET Framework 5, we moved those to system private core lib. .NET Framework 5. .NET 5, we moved those four mod op types to SPC.
Yeah, I think my question was even more basic. Is like I think we already have the API approved, I believe, right? Because I'm pretty sure we already have there was a meeting on the required mod op that we put in system runtime compiler services, I believe, for unmanaged. Right. Okay, so then this is literally just this one bit that we would have to add.
We need a bit in signature calling convention so that we can emit it in the compiler, and then there's a related one for the runtime flag, which I assume is the next proposal.
Yeah. So by the way, if we add an enum member here, does that mean we have to ref the IL format for that, or how does that work?
No. So you can already. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes. Oh, okay. Sorry. You can already, using ILASM, basically encode whatever bit value you want. So, for example, in IL, you could type 0x9 as the value of the calling convention, and that will encode as 9. It won't be usable on a runtime that doesn't recognize it, but you can already encode it, use it, etc.
I see. So adding members, basically, I guess the spec says there's a value, and if you don't know the value, then you fail at runtime, but it's still valid in metadata.
Right.
Yep.
All right. So that makes sense then.
So essentially, if you're on an older runtime, so not .NET 5, the runtime will encounter the bit, and it will do whatever that runtime does. I'm assuming it will throw an exception and fail fast, probably a type load exception. And then on the newer runtimes, it will actually interpret it and use it correctly.
Gotcha.
Yep. And then that particular bit is what the next API is going to be used for as well.
And so unmanaged, is this already a term that we use elsewhere, or because I think we have the term unmanaged code before, but we never used the calling convention for that. It's just literally native code.
So if you look in 3.3.5, the way that all of the existing bits are specified are as either default or unmanaged cdecl, unmanaged stdcall, unmanaged thiscall, unmanaged fastcall as 2 words. There is some question as to whether, in my mind at least, as to whether or not as just unmanaged is a good term here.
Right.
What I've been viewing it as is more like unmanaged extension, because it's like this is the unmanaged extensibility bit.
So basically, it's the platform default, right? Really?
Yeah. Well, not necessarily. It's unmanaged platform default, and this is what Jan brought up when we were talking about naming. Was it's unmanaged platform default or the combination of mod ops on the return type if specified, which is not a name we want to publish.
Right. So in .NET 5, the only valid thing will be unmanaged. You can't have any mod ops on it. The runtime will fail. The plan is, for example, for .NET 6, we will extend it so that at a minimum, GC suppressed transition, callconv GC suppressed transition is a supported mod opt. If that exists, the GC will treat it as if it has the suppress GC transition attribute. It's not being encoded as an attribute because function pointers don't support attributes. So we have to do this new thing to support it instead. And in the future, we may have, for example, a callconv vector call bit, which allows you to say, this is the vector call, and this is how we're going to support it moving forward because we have a finite number of bits. And there are, 20 plus calling conventions defined in LLVM and Clang that we could theoretically support someday. There's also other scenarios such as stdcall plus thiscall, which is used in com-interop, and it is actually a combination of both rather than uniquely either.
I see. So it really, what Fred just said is basically true. It says there's a calling convention that's expressed as modrec, so look at the return type.
Right. It's basically saying this is an unmanaged calling convention. If there's no mod ops, then it's the default. If there are mod ops, then it modifies the default calling convention based on that mod opt.
Yeah, I guess unmanaged is fine. I mean, it's a.
Yeah.
I mean, it seems like they all are very specific anyway, so you have to kind of read the manual, so it seems fine. It's just the only reason I'm asking is because we use unmanaged usually as a very broad stroke, and it didn't seem very specific in that sense, but it seems like the specificity here comes from other data that is elsewhere, so it makes sense to be fairly vague in the name.
And what about return attribute defined?
What was that, sorry?
So what about something like return attribute defined?
Well, so I guess that is technically true if you don't have any mod ops on. Well, it would be not attribute; it'd be mod opt. But it is technically true that if there are no return types, no return types mod ops, then it is defined by it.
Yeah, I mean, or return ops defined or something that says this is where you go to find the answer. Like, essentially what it means is external, right? Of I don't have the answer here, go ask someone else. But if we invent a new pattern later, it's external 1 and external 2. So just trying to say right now that this is, return ops defined.
Well, it's not even necessarily return mod opt. It's part of the type, not necessarily the return value. And
well, it's whatever the first mod ops are after the param count, which means that it goes before the ref if one exists, and they're technically on the return type.
Okay, but I think the general point is that this is the unmanaged calling convention. It's unmanaged, just the direct counterpart to managed. Managed being the stuff that the CLR creates, and unmanaged being the stuff that the CLR does not create.
And also, I do want to point out so we do have prior art here in that the pinvoke equivalent of this is WinAPI, which we don't want to put into our. We regret putting WinAPI as in the first place, and we don't want to do that here. But that is the technical prior art.
Right. Yeah, I mean, to me, the only reason why I wouldn't put in return type defined in it is God forbid we ever find another creative way to put mod regs elsewhere, and then now the misnamed, right?
We could call it mod opt defined.
Is it mod opt or mod reg?
It's mod opt, but I guess we don't necessarily. I guess in some future world we could do mod regs. I mean, mod ops are mostly because that's what the C++ compiler did. So.
But rec is really like opt++, right? So you can sort of hand wave at that one.
I'm surprised that it's not a mod rec, because technically, if you don't know what it means, you shouldn't call the method, right? Because your layout will be fucked.
Well, so what C++, we're kind of following the C++ spec here, which is they would put not only the calling convention bit, but they would also put this mod opt on the return type. And so so yes, if you don't know what it is, you shouldn't necessarily interpret it, but the language itself doesn't really need to know about the whole point of this design was the language doesn't need to know what valid combinations there are. It just needs to take them.
Right. So it's optional to the compile, but required to the runtime.
Yes.
The ECMA 335 spec also explicitly uses the term unmanaged to refer to unmanaged calling conventions, unmanaged code, etc. I honestly don't think that something more explicitly named is going to be clearer when viewed in combination with the ECMA spec.
I mean, the only thing we could do is give it a name like modifier defined or something, right? But I think unmanaged is also fine. As I said, all of them you basically have to look up. but yeah, basically the idea would be we give it a name that is kind of sensible, but at the same time there's a mapping table you have to consult to see what the layout is, right? And the mapping table might say go look at the return type specification.
Yeah, because my only oddity with unmanaged is honestly a fast call, a this call, a standard call, and a cdecal are all unmanaged calling conventions because they're not the managed calling conventions.
Right.
And so it's a weird. I know we're not a flag xenum, but does it feel like it's trying to be hyper inclusive or say any and go figure it out? But it's not. It's saying there's different rules and they're over here. And so I would slightly prefer that we indicate that it's, mod defined or whatever. Like, but if unmanaged is the best word we can come up with, I don't care a whole lot.
I had been using unmanaged extensible in my documents as just a placeholder word for whatever we come up with. Could use that.
It seems like the user just needs to know what a lot of these mean anyway. So a super clear name maybe doesn't get us a huge amount here.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, I would just literally go with the proposed name because it seems the easiest one. I mean,
yeah, there's also other considerations like CDECL doesn't exist on x64 or on ARM platform conventions. In fact, on ARM platform, CDECL standard call, this call, and fast call will all produce the same code gen. The C# compiler still won't allow conversion because of type identity, but they are all the same and they don't actually apply. There's so much consideration you have to put in once you get down to I'm omitting IL metadata and what is and isn't compatible that users really need to refer to the spec for this stuff.
Along those lines, what audience do we anticipate actually using this particular enum?
compiler
The
authors.
compiler.
Yeah.
So people who are already familiar with ECMAS 335.
Hopefully.
Yeah. You basically shouldn't need to use this enum unless you are reading or writing metadata, either because you're dynamically constructing types or because you're a compiler.
Yeah, so like looking at ECMA 335 and 2, I think that's 2 and not 11, .15.3, it talks about the existing ones we already have here as unmanaged CDECL, unmanaged fast call, unmanaged standard call, unmanaged this call. So it does feel weird that we just now have this bare word unmanaged. So it feels weird to me. But
when you think about it in the terms of IL, just unmanaged by itself is unmanaged platform default, so no modifier. Unmanaged CDECL is then unmanaged calling convention CDECL modified. And then once you get into modops, you would have unmanaged modopt vector call, which logically reads as unmanaged vector call, and therefore is fluent in the same pattern.
Yeah.
So if you were writing IL, you would read it essentially the same way. You would just encode it slightly differently.
I suggest we move on, given that the API is used by 5 people in the world.
Indeed.
All right, so I just marked it approved as basically is. Unless somebody has strong opposition, I would go ahead with that.
Cool.
All right, so then this is the corresponding other thing then, I guess?
Yep. And so basically this feature of the runtime that would support this unmanaged flag, we would like to be able to detect when the runtime supports it in the compiler. And so I'm proposing adding a flag to runtime feature that we can look at.
So this was one of the things where we had some discussion on whether we should do it or not, right? I think Jan basically said something on the lines of like, instead of doing that, probe for the presence of the attribute. And then I think you said, well, they're not strictly speaking tied to each other, right? So
right. So the attribute thing is unmanaged callers only, which is an attribute being added to .NET 5, which users can put on a method, on a static method, and then when the runtime sees that method, it will actually emit a stub that is the unmanaged calling convention specified by that attribute. C# won't let you directly call that method. You must directly convert it to a function pointer with that calling convention on it. So we could use that attribute as the flag here. There'd be a couple of things we would need to change. Well, there'd be one thing we need to change. Currently, the attribute, I believe, is defined in system runtime. We weren't going to require that attribute is actually defined in system private core lib. But if we want to use that attribute as the detection mechanism for whether or not the runtime supports this feature, it needs to be in the runtime. So it would need to be in system private core lib.
yeah, so but it's one of those areas where
Sorry, can I just ask a quick question for clarification? Several times you've made a distinction between private corelib and system.runtime, but from the compiler's perspective, it doesn't see system private corelib. So I'm curious.
It needs to be in the attribute needs to be defined to the compiler's view in the library that defines system.object and has no references.
Which is the system
Right,
runtime
so that ends up being
assembly.
one.
Okay, so then it wasn't defined. Then Jan asked me if this needed to be in the same library that defines the call comc types, and I said not necessarily. So I assumed that meant it wasn't.
So basically what you're saying is because you're inferring runtime behavior, you don't want this type to be in some random assembly that potentially is user defined, right? You want to make sure that this is coming from the runtime, and one of the easiest way to do it is to say it's the corelib, right?
Yeah, that's fine. I just wanted to make sure we weren't doing anything weird like with the compiler trying to reference corelib.
It's in the
Tanner, go ahead.
I think it's looking
runtime interrupts or.
I think he said it's in system.runtime.interrupt services.
Yeah.
.dll.
Right, it's in that ref assembly today, and if we want it, we'd have to move it down to runtime. It is in corelib, but it would need to be moved down to system runtime if the compiler wants to depend on it.
I think to me, like, this is...
That makes sense.
Yeah, like, to me, honestly, at this point, that seems more like a wash then. Like, I'd rather add a field to runtime feature that seems cleaner than doing, some crazy gymnastics with type forwarding. I mean, it kind of makes sense to me that runtime behavior is something that the runtime needs to define, not the user, right? So either keying it off of corelib or the runtime feature type seems reasonable. Like, we originally invented runtime features for things that you can't key off of API surface, right? But I kind of agree with after Fred giving more details, it seems weird to key it off of the attribute because it's kind of like some random other type that is part of the feature set, and that seems not very straightforward. It's almost like saying the runtime supports async because some random as method exists somewhere as opposed to task of t, right? So like that seems kind of similar here. Like the calling convention is really like a core concept that the runtime has to support, and as such, I probably would prefer a field as well here than some random type that we now also have to type forward down to system.runtime. That seems weird.
Well, I don't think we'd actually have to type forward it because we're adding it in .NET 5. So.
Oh, I see. So we would just add it to system runtime instead of runtime services. Yeah, I mean, it kind of I guess that's fair. It just seems odd that
I'd still prefer this solution mainly because they're different features, right? Like unmanaged calling convention or unmanaged callers only is being added at the same time as this, but it's not this. It's not this.
And a runtime, a non-Microsoft owned runtime implementation could theoretically implement one, but not both if they are separate.
Yep.
Yeah, does anybody have any concerns of adding it to runtime features? I think Jan basically just said let's not make this a dumping ground for all new compiler features, which I think I agree with, but this seems more like a runtime type system constraint, which to me honestly belongs to runtime feature.
Yeah, because F# also going to need to check for this if they eventually add function pointer support, as well as any other language.
Well, true. I mean, that doesn't necessarily mean it has to be this, right? It just means whatever mechanism we envision, every compiler would have to use the same mechanism for that. But yeah, like that also kind of makes it harder to explain when it's like, well, for these runtime features, use this thing, and for these other runtime features, use this other mechanism that is.
Well, and I think one of the other interesting things is Mono, for example. Mono might want to bring in the new attribute for suppress for unmanaged callers only, but they might not have implemented the new runtime feature for the new unmanaged. Yeah, for general unmanaged calling convention.
I hear no objections.
Yeah, I'm just typing. It seems runtime type systems type system constraints would belong to. All right, so let me just paste this in so that everybody.
While Fred's here, there's also one other compiler attribute request for that's blocking, which is the add native integer attribute. I believe Fred's the secondary reviewer on that for Chuck.
Maybe.
Do you know the issue number, Tanner?
38683.
683.
Oh, 683.
It's relatively straightforward. It's just an attribute that allows encoding whether a given return or parameter is native int versus int pointer.
And the benefit of adding this is mainly that we avoid duplication with the compiler having to emit it itself into every assembly.
Right. The compiler will emit it itself if it doesn't exist, but that can, that's going to require redefining native integer attribute in any assembly that defines it. So it's similar to the other similar things we've done, like for nullable and other bits.
Well, nullable we ended up not adding.
No. I thought the compiler generates this attribute for you. It's not like null. Like with nullable, you'd have to copy and paste the attributes you want to use in.
No. The compiler will generate the nullable attribute as well. If it's not.
Oh, you're talking the nullable attribute, not like the not null.
Not maybe null, not
the helpers.
Users don't use this attribute.
Right, but in the nullable attribute case, like we didn't add that to the framework, did we?
No, we did not.
We did not.
No, we did not.
Right.
Like that's.
So I'm wondering why this one's special.
So basically, the bar that we had is we said
I'm
we
trying to
only
message
add
Chuck.
attributes that users are referenced manually because that's a pain in the ass if they have to copy and paste the definition of the attribute. So everything that the user is expected to put in brackets, we will add. For things that the compiler will synthesize happily, we basically said we don't care, and we ended up not adding nullable. I mean, I think there was some concern with metadata bloat, but I guess the argument was it doesn't really matter because it's so tiny.
It's one per assembly, right?
Yeah, it's one per assembly, and they're not big to begin with.
Yeah, I mean they don't need to be reference equal. I'm messaging Chuck right now. He hasn't seen my message yet. I'm not exactly sure what. Can you scroll down? Maybe he talks more about why he.
Nope,
Okay.
there's no context. I can just respond to this and say for now we assume it's only needed by the compiler, so we would say we wouldn't add it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the same as nullable attribute, and I don't.
Yeah.
And if we didn't add that, I don't know why we would need to add this, but I'm not. There could be something I'm missing.
We've also added several other ones that the compiler auto-synthesizes, though. Just because it provides
besides extensions, which other ones?
I'm trying to pull it up right now. But most, as far as I'm aware, most of them except for nullable, we've actually ended up adding helpers for over the long term. Just because it allows other compilers to key off the same one without also synthesizing their own type, and just makes things overall nicer. Sorry, my internet's being very spotty right now.
Tanner, what's the point of adding this attribute to a class?
I believe it allows you to encode. So just like with nullable, you can put it on a higher level to encode things more explicitly. It allows you to save on metadata bloat.
Gotcha.
So, for example, you could encode the fields all at once rather than encoding it on every individual field.
Yeah, so like I'll just let's just close it, and then I mean if there's a reason to bring it back, then we just reopen this. Like I just want to avoid like holding the whole meeting hostage on this one because we don't know. All right, so then.
All right.
Logging.
I think that was it for me.
I think that was it. Yeah.
Gonna wait 5 seconds this time before logging off so that Aaron doesn't ask a question immediately after I close. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Later.
Wait, I have a question.
Good timing. So this one already took us like ages last time. So who wants to drive this?
Hi. Yeah.
Hey, Miriam.
Did you refresh the page?
Totally. Last minute edits. Let me click on the thing again. Yep, here we go. It's reloading.
Yes. Yeah. So I have a link in there. Just I thought I would simplify the what we look at. So in the middle I have a gist for the API usages and the APIs as well.
So what should I click on?
You see usage and new APIs.
This one here?
The gist there.
Oh yeah, okay, so that's perfect.
Should we wait for David to join? Let me ping him. Okay. So until David joins, I can give a walkthrough of what we talked about last time, and then what we wanted to update. So if you remember, we had, for the logger options, we were using interface, iConsole logger formatter options, and then we were going to use a base class instead, so that's an update. If towards the bottom of the ref file. That's one thing, and then there was iConsole log formatter that had an issue with, like, we wanted to see if we wanted to do format versus write. That's one of the feedbacks, and I think the third feedback was with this new set of APIs, then we should be able to use like VT100 internally until the BCL system console APIs are available, and then we could internally replace what we have implemented when we have system console in the future. Let me see if David joined.
I pinged David, but he didn't respond. So we can just continue. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. So the second file shows usages as well.
So let me try to make this slightly more readable.
So maybe we can start from the list of the feedback we got in the first time. I mean, we can go through it.
Yeah. That's the last comment Emil put in the issue page.
Sorry,
you put a comment there.
Here we go.
So at console, there was an overload. I removed that. We were using this interface, iConsole logger options. So now that's replaced with base type, abstract base type. And then the second two bullet points. Yeah, if you remember the conversation about VT100, what we talked about is that we don't want to expose any classes or types in order to write logs. We just pass a text writer, and that's what we're doing in the APIs. And the fourth bullet point says, should iConsole log formatter pass a text, right? So basically the second two bullet points are covered as well.
Okay, so I'm almost there. Yeah, God knows why that doesn't do syntax highlighting, but it is what it is. So I basically took your gist and I just removed some of the namespaces so we can... Oh, I have to refresh the page. For some reason it doesn't do it.
I can sign? Okay.
So here we go.
Okay.
Because the namespaces make it somewhat longish. Yeah,
right.
So we removed all the color stuff from it already, right?
Yeah, the color, yes. So if you look at, there is an interface called iConsole log formatter. It has an API called write.
Which one? The
Is lower at the bottom. iConsole log formatter. Yeah.
Right.
The last interface you see. We're just passing down a text writer here. It's the last argument.
And then the idea is public extenders of this would just write ANSI codes to get color. Even though we don't have like decent APIs for it, they can just hard code the strings in for ANSI.
Yeah, I think this is the idea. Yes.
I see. So let me try to make this. Okay, so I think I got it now. All right, so what is the flow? So like the usage is basically where do you start, I guess?
In the gist, you can see a bunch of usages I prepared.
I see. Okay.
Yeah. So these are the usages, and then the last file shows the existing usage and how you can compare how it would differ. But yeah, basically, you can either do line 3 builder.addConsole, which would be the existing behavior, or yeah. So you can specify your formatter. So we have this line 7 shows a new property formatter name. You can specify any of the 3 built-in formatters, default, systemd, or JSON. And so basically in this lines between 6 to 9, you're kind of configuring your console logger options. The remaining console logger options are deprecated, so therefore, as an example, include scopes or use timestamp, they would be formatter-specific options. So then, if you want to configure them, you're going to configure them with the formatter. So line 13 shows usage when you want to not only pick a default formatter, but you also want to configure its options.
Looks Pavel have a question here or comment.
Oh yes.
Question. So in practice, only one of these formatters would be used globally for the application. Why do we have both add methods and then the ability to set the current formatter instead of having just set methods, set extension methods? So you would call set default, or like apply default console logger formatter, or apply JSON console logger formatter without having to set the name later. Because you won't be using, like, registering multiple and using multiple later doesn't make a ton of sense. You'll be only using, in theory, the last one you added, or the one you picked.
So two things, like one is the scenario where you use a library to enable more formatters, but you don't turn it on by default. You can imagine in Azure them offering more like providers, but not setting it at the same time. So we want to decouple adding it and setting it, just in general.
But is it real? Like,
yeah.
why would you add it without setting it? Like, why do you need it?
Because they're different actors doing the adding and setting. The user may be the one doing the setting, but they are the one doing the adding.
So
right?
if we ship a formatter, we would have to ship some type with the formatter name. Why won't we ship the extension method directly to enable the formatter?
Because in the cases where you aren't the one calling it, where some library called it on your behalf, or if you use an iHosting startup that actually did it on your behalf because you're running in Azure, then it's going to add it for you, but it won't actually set the default because maybe you want to change it, or maybe you go into configuration and you want to change it on the fly to be something else. So the person doing the actual consuming and the person doing the adding are sometimes different. But so that's the first thing. The second thing is if you call add formatter without calling add console, it still works. So these methods are actually shortcut and do the actual setting of the name and the adding of the provider. So you kind of get the best of both worlds by depending on your entry point. And don't think of the formatter name as the only way of configuring it. You can configure it in configuration. So you may not have any code at all, and you're only going into your config file and setting the name to something else, because you want to change between systemd and console or one line or JSON.
But you have to add it beforehand anyway for it to keep working.
Yes, someone has to add it beforehand. Agreed.
So it's like not super working scenario if you don't add it beforehand. It's not fully console based.
Right.
Yeah, I'm just wondering because it seems we are complicating the surface quite a bit to enable this.
So like just to be clear, to enable like JSON formatting, you call add JSON and nothing else. And that was a change made from the set of feedback we got last time, where you had to call like add console and then call add blah. So now, if you do call add console, then you can choose to set a name there. But if you don't call it, you can call like directly add JSON log console formatter, and that will do the right adding of add console. So you don't have to do both calls, which makes it more complicated.
Is it worth renaming the method then?
To what?
So you don't call add JSON console log formatter, you call add JSON console logger. Or add JSON console.
That's fine. That's not bad.
Because then, like, to me, after looking at this API, it seemed like I need to add console and add a formatter for console. But what you're saying makes it way simpler. And if I only have to call add systemd console, it's a pretty nice usage.
Yeah. That's good feedback.
Sorry, I was grabbing a drink. Did I miss anything important?
Yeah, we all agreed, so we can stop now. I'm gonna go home.
That seems like a good plan.
Wait, I am home. Hold on.
You're living at work now, in case you didn't know.
That's so depressing. Don't say that.
But it's true. We should stop saying working from home. We should stay living at work. All right, did we change anything in the APIs, or is that still the same?
Miriam, do you agree with that?
With the feedback?
Yeah.
Because
it's mostly naming.
If I just have, so rather, the feedback I think is that rather than add JSON console log formatter, we would have add JSON console.
Yep.
And then So basically, the last three console logger extensions APIs are just going to have the log formatter at the end removed. Like it's just going to be add default console log, add JSON console log, and add system console log.
And then the one that has the generic add console log formatter, that would maybe be add. Actually, I'm not sure about that one. That's fine.
Add console with formatter.
With you changing the verbs on us, changing.
Okay. Okay.
I mean, whatever, it's fine. I don't have any strong opinions there.
So basically, we just
What is
strip formatter from the names. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah.
Stripping log formatter from the names.
Wait, no. Yes, exactly. That one.
Okay.
So then we'll end up with the first 5 will just be add console.
I do have questions about the add console of T.
Yeah, that's just I was just throwing it in case there were feedbacks on the rest of them.
Sorry, so the one that we have, so we currently also have add console log. It takes a T format and a T option. There would also be add console. So only the last 3 would have log at the end.
Oh. So the add console log formatter maybe should be.
It's adding a formatter. It's not adding a log. It's not actually adding a.
I mean, it kind of is doing the same thing that the same thing that the other ones are doing. It's just more it's a more verbose way of specifying the T. So maybe it should match the name.
Do you mind scrolling down because I wanted to show something
Totally.
in the usages. As with there's in the usages there's one with add console log formatter.
Down further, Emo. Faster.
Oh, so you're in the issue page. I mean in the gist.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. So usage add line 48. Even though we don't, as Pavel said, we wouldn't use 2 different add console log formatters, but like assuming we did, then you would also need to do add console because if it's a custom formatter, you have to somehow specify the name of the formatter, right?
Yep.
That's why I say add console log formatter is not adding console, it's adding the formatter.
So I'm sorry, I still feel like I'm missing how the feature works. Like, so what are these new APIs doing? They're basically, at a high level, they add both the console output logger as well as a formatter, right? Is that basically what they do?
Yep.
And then so
these lower level ones are just doing one thing instead of doing the combine thing. So basically, the lower level APIs add console log formatter are adding just a formatter to the system, but not turning it on. And it's basically what you use to build the other extension methods on top of.
So I guess so basically what you're saying is like if I write a JSON console logger, then basically I would have options that are specific to how I format the JSON. So that's why I have a generic for the options because it's specific to me. I have a generic for the formatter because I'm inheriting some other formatter and where I basically, do the toString effectively.
Yep.
And so the other extension methods are implemented over the one that takes T formatter and T options.
Correct. That's right.
And so was the idea of using a different name so that the overloads look better, or what was the reason for that?
Yeah. Basically.
I mean,
this whole thing is a shortcut to write a console logger with different formatting. So it doesn't seem bad to call it add black console.
I mean, to be honest, I don't think so. Having the same method is probably not bad because if you actually open IntelliSense, people will not be very likely to call them because they're a pain in the ass to construct. But I don't think people will accidentally stumble their way into these APIs and then get like lost or something. But I feel like it does add value to group them together because it's easier to explain in the docs if you say, well, these are the building blocks for adding to the console stuff. The first two are effectively just the simple ones, and then from there it gets progressively more advanced, right? And I think that's probably an easier story than trying to come up with some sort of convoluted naming convention where because you run out of names, right? It's this Java problem where everything is in manager and extension and plugin and
Question: how much benefit these methods bring on top of calling add service and calling configure with the options class?
It does a bunch. So like, remember we added overloads and we added like a bunch of methods to make it easy to write a logger provider and get change tokens. And get an I options that was wired to configuration to do things like that. It does the same kind of thing. So
I see. So
super useful.
It's way more than that. Okay.
Yeah. Yep.
So if there's no objection with like set the usage line 49 to 67, then I don't really see a reason to add the add console of t. I was just adding it just in case there is feedback.
Yeah, that's fine. I would newt the add console of t because
sounds good.
This is for people building methods that are nicer to use. So I think it's fine to have this one not be as nice.
Sure. So line 49 to 67 is a okay sample. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, people basically copy what we do.
So we keep these and we nuke this.
No, we nuked the one on line 70.
Yeah. So the
yeah.
API add console of t won't be there anymore.
Okay, so that means in terms of APIs, we would say this guy is gone.
Yes.
These guys are getting renamed to add console.
Yep.
And these guys stay as is, the last three, without the formatter, or with the formatter.
Without the long formatter.
So that would just be add default console, add JSON console, and add systemd console.
Yeah, we should discuss what add default console is.
Yeah, should we drop it completely?
Yeah, what is that one? I forgot.
Let's see the arguments it takes.
Default console log formatter options.
So if you remember, console log formatter options is the base class, and then JSON and default console logger options. Just use more properties, extend it.
I guess, but then why would I use this one over the regular add console that takes console logger options?
Yeah.
Right.
Because if you don't have the last three, you don't know how to. You can't configure default JSON or systemd options. The second add console overload is not allowing you to configure formatter options. It's just configuring the logger options.
Yeah, but for default formatter options, can we just reuse the old type and not add any overload?
So one thing that changed is a bunch of the options on the console logger options got moved out into the individual formatter options. That's what I think at default console would be configuring.
That's
yeah. That was the other question I was going to ask is what do we do about backcompat? Where do we flow these old options? Do we flow them into the default console log formatter options? Because we would have to, right, for apps to keep working the same as they did.
So like for backward compatibility, if someone is using the old usage, if they're specifying on their console logger options, let's say include scopes and whatnot, it's gonna bubble itself down to the formatter options. If it's systemd or default, it will put it on whichever of the two. But that's just, I think, just in case. This is just so that. But then it's still going to be deprecated. It's not recommended to use console logger options deprecated properties.
Is it worth deprecating and then duplicating the same set of options, or maybe we should just make the new formatters use the old option types, and if they need more, inherit from it? I don't know. I'm sorry, I wasn't here for the first review, so I may be repeating.
No, I think you're onto something here. So let me ask a different question. Is the motivation to have a new type purely so that we can remove the old concepts? Because then, maybe a better option is you just obsolete the things that actually don't make sense anymore, like, the formatter name and the format itself, and basically leave all the other ones as is, and you just hide the ones you don't want to promote, and then you make all the new ones just inherit from the old one. Because that has fewer moving pieces, right? You basically don't. But if that's not what you want, then the question is, why would you not obsolete the console, like the old console logger options and the old add console overload that takes it? Because it seems weird to me to have both console logger options and default console logger options, but then everything on the old console logger options is basically obsoleted. It seems weird.
I think we spent some time on this in the last meeting, which is if we obsolete console logger options, how do you specify the formatter name? You need somewhere to specify which formatter is chosen. So just by virtue of that, console logger options has to remain.
So that's the thing I still don't understand. Like, I thought that the new overloads take care of that.
They do, but they actually use the formatter name option on console logger options.
So are you saying that the new ones are implemented in terms of the old one?
Yeah.
And not quite, Emo. I think when you're saying old, it's getting a little confusing.
Crusty.
The new extension methods set the formatter name on console logger options.
That's what I mean. So by old, I mean the console logger options type, as opposed, and by new, I mean the default console log formatter options.
Right, but let's get, like, what we were trying to do is separate some concerns, right? The console logger option allows you to pick which formatter is being used, but actual formatting concerns, like what the timestamp is or whether you include scopes, go to each of the individual formatters.
Gotcha.
Is confusion with having two types now better than confusion we would have had if some loggers didn't support some options? So let's say JSON logger doesn't support timestamp format, and customer says timestamp format and it doesn't apply. Customer is confused. But is it better than customer seeing two option types and having the set of fields on both of them?
So Emo, can you put both option types in view? Scroll down a little bit so we can see the option types.
Yep.
So the only ones that wouldn't apply, if we kept the old one and we didn't do the new one.
So include scopes.
Are you talking about log to standard or threshold?
No, what we're saying though is, imagine we just use console logger options as the base type replace console log formatter options with console logger options. Just use it everywhere as the base type, and then deal with the fact that some things are weird.
Yeah, I think I understand now what Shurab was saying. That also explains the naming. Basically, you basically the way to think about this, you have one way to say where does the data go, and then there's another way of saying, okay, how should the data be formatted, right? That's why everything was suffixed with log formatter, right? Which is the way to say this is. So basically, it's different concerns, right? If you now make them extend each other, you basically blend them on the same type, but that's weird because the type doesn't actually do any sort of formatting anymore, right?
You don't have to inherit two, right? We can just say all the options are on the old type. Formatter options have its own base type, but if required, they would read off console logger options.
Yeah, I guess.
So we support that for back compat, right? But it's weird as a pattern to have some options, like something set on one options class and something set on another options class, because formatters are going to extend it and add more functionality, right?
Yeah. So I don't have a huge opinion here, but
I feel like this is the least bad because it gives us a chance to deprecate and then get to a place where the API is clean.
So I have another question. Like, why do we have the indirection over the formatter name to begin with? Why don't we set the options directly on the console logger options? Why don't we have a field of type console log formatter options that you
On
just said?
console logger options?
Yeah.
Because if I want to have my own custom formatter and it has a property called my custom property, then so then console logger options would have a property, and when you're recommending it would have a property called, let's say, formatter options. What would the type be? Would it be console log formatter options, and then anyone can extend their own?
Yeah, basically what I'm suggesting is, like, it's supposed to split. So, like, if you look at this, right, you basically have, this is basically configuring where the data goes, right? And then this is basically configuring how the data is formatted. Like, why would we not just change the console logger options to effectively have properties of type formatter and formatter options? And you basically, when you initialize the console logger options, you basically get to say what it looks like and what the options are, right? Like why are these separated out and then glued together by the name property? That seems somewhat odd.
Wait, what?
So what I'm wondering is, like if so let's say you new up a console logger options, right? And then there's a property of type console log formatter options and console log formatter that you just did literally assign into these options.
Yep.
Like, why is this indirection over the formatter name? Like, that seems like, if you would just deprecate this property here and you would say you literally assign it into this thing here, then I don't think it's super odd that disable colors lives on the container, right? Like, because it's like, well, the concept already existed, but it's in the same place where you would do other things, right? It's not quite as jarring as a transition.
How do you make it work for configuration-based systems? Where you set a name and configuration and have that just work like magic? So that's the issue, right? Like, for that scenario, you really want the name as a feature.
Yeah, I guess I don't know enough about config. Like, how does the name help you in the config?
So you put a name of the formatter in config. You do systemd or JSON or whatever name you want, and then that flows. That basically becomes the name field here, and then the system understands either a name set from code or from configuration, and it just works because we map the list of providers to the name that was here.
You can see a sample in the issue page. You're in it, just scroll up if you can. You see this is like an app settings file, app settings JSON file, and then under logging console, like you see formatter name is JSON, right?
I see.
And then if someone wants to set up their options, right below formatter name, there's formatter options. Inside this formatter options blob, that's where they would put their properties, right? And it doesn't matter. So basically it's gonna pick up the formatter options from all the properties inside formatter options. And previously, instead of formatter name, we had format, and then format was the either JSON, was either systemd or default, and then right where you see formatter name now, we would have had those properties, but now they're all one level deeper inside formatter options.
Yeah, I see now. Yeah.
I'll tell you what, the name isn't great because the name doesn't really describe what it is. So if anything, could we somehow expose the default log formatter options as a property of the console log format as a property of the console logger options? Does that make sense? I still keep the name, but then like.
Or should we change the name default?
To what? Standard?
Yeah.
Built in?
They're all built in.
Built-in defaults.
Well, I mean, it's basically so. Why can I not use console log formatter options directly? Like, why do we have a default one and a base type? Like, why isn't the base type already usable as the default?
Right.
So console log formatter options. Default one also has like color properties, but then but then we have if you remember, we had default versus systemd, and then systemd was simpler. It's just one liner and it doesn't have colors. So that's I don't know how to explain. But was that your question? You were wondering why default console log formatter, not the.
I think default is a misnomer, that it's not like it's not a subset of all other formatters. It's just a particular. It's what we write to console today.
Okay, so then I guess, okay, I know. Okay, basically you call it text console log formatter options because that's really what it is, right? It's not JSON, it's text.
It's like color text.
Yeah, and basically you can either, it's basically text that where we colorize, I don't know, quotes or something, right? But like, yeah, that makes sense to me then. The other thing I would suggest is strip the log, just call it console logger and console formatter. I think that makes more sense conceptually.
Okay.
Question. I don't understand the text comment. Like, A, it's all text, but B, like systemd, that's just text as well, right? It's
fair enough. I mean, maybe plain. I don't know. Like, but basically, I guess what Sharav was saying, I think is the important one, right? It's not like default sounds like it's some sort of specialized like subset kind of thing when it's really it's a very particular log format, right?
It's the default format.
Yeah, but I guess default is not a great name because it kind of implies that everything else could be configured to be like the default, right? Because it's I don't know. I mean, plain text or text would work for me, but I
or could be colored.
I kind of like standard formatter.
Sure.
Yeah, standard wouldn't be bad, but like in the context with console, that kind of implies standard out, I guess, which might not be what you want.
Why there's standard error as well.
How about colored console log formatter options?
Sorry, say again.
It has disabled colors.
Because it has a disabled colors property, it could be called colored rather than default console log formatter options. That's if you don't want to keep default.
Let me ask you differently. Like, do you expect people to use the default console log one, or do you only provide it for backwards compat?
No, we expect people to use it. Like, it was designed because it's the easiest to parse in like your inner loop. Like we split things across multiple lines, we colorize. So it is the nicest experience while working locally.
I mean, you could call it. Yeah, you could.
.NET new MVC. This is the one it's going to use.
I see. So I mean, maybe use simple or plain then, maybe.
Okay.
Simple sounds fine.
Yeah, simple's fine.
Okay.
And then, do people like my suggestion of removing log and just call it formatter?
Oh, okay. Rather than calling it formatter.
Yeah, basically every time so now when you say console log, you just say console. So it's like console formatter options rather than console log formatter options.
Because you're in the logging namespace. It's kind of.
Yeah, like everything is a log here, right? But it just, because you already have very long type names and the log doesn't really help you much. And I kind of like the idea that you have a console logger and a console formatter, and they're basically the two independent concerns you're modeling.
Okay.
But just as a nit, like in another world, we could have had the formatter work across all logger providers. Our current implementation, these formatters are scoped specifically to the console logger.
Yeah, console is still in the name. He's just saying drop out log.
Yeah.
Oh, so it would be like JSON console formatter options.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because basically you have two options. Basically you have two ideas, but you have the console logger, which is basically controlling how it's outputted, and then you have the console formatter, which is the thing that controls what it looks like. And right now the second thing is just extended by one more term in the middle, which seems odd.
This doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
May I also add console logger options? Pretty much everything gets deprecated except for formatter name, which gets added, and existing property called log to standard error threshold. That doesn't get deprecated because it's not a formatter property, it's a logger property. And just wanted to point that out. And you can see it in a usage as well. I have log to standard error threshold property, how it's set up. It's just basically set up the old way.
I see. All right, so let me just do the edits that I just talked about so we don't forget about them. Yeah, that was not good. Oh, fuck me.
Wait, is this recorded?
It is.
Emo drops F-bombs.
Oh yeah, I have no shame for that like that.
I was like, is that like, do we have to edit him out?
No,
It's
he's
being
actually
live
exercising
streamed.
restraint.
Exactly.
And
Normally
it's
when
being
I'm
live streamed, YouTube already sees it and hears it.
Let me help you. Beep, beep,
so I mean what I'm really thinking about this thing is and
beep.
but I'm not saying that aloud, right? Okay. Unfortunately, my suggestion is a pain in the ass to do because log is also part of logger, so I can't just replace all occurrences. So it's you have to go
That's
one by
fine.
one.
Thank you.
Log formatter to formatter. Right?
Basically, that's the only, so yeah, so as Eric said, console log formatter options, the three of them, JSON, default, and the main one, we strip the log from them, and then there's nothing else.
No, I think
Oh, it's just
everywhere
the-
where we say console log formatter turns into console formatter.
Yeah, I guess that works. Yeah, editing wise, that should be what I wanted to do. Yeah.
Like the interface, yeah, all the options, classes, any properties.
And then we said default is simple.
Simple. And then that's the name as well, right? You would in configuration you would say formatter equals simple or systemd or JSON or a custom.
Right, yes.
Yeah. Okay.
That works. So we would say default is simple. And then the enum would also, I guess the enum we can't change, right? Because the enum already exists.
The enum deprecated?
Yeah, the enum is deprecated, it exists as either default or systemd.
Yeah. Yeah, that works. And then did we make
and we remove the add console T overload because we didn't need that.
Okay, so I think I have made all the changes now. Let's go back to the methods then. Like, do we make any changes to the method names?
Yeah, we decided to drop log formatter, right? Of the last three.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
then at default becomes at simple.
So what I'm thinking is maybe we should drop the word console from them and replace it with formatter. So it would be add simple formatter, add JSON formatter, add systemd formatter.
Well, no, not we can't do that because it actually hangs off the logging builder, so it's unclear that it's for console specifically.
Mm-hmm.
I see. Then I would probably still go with like console formatter, right? Because it, like, if you want to promote that this is the difference between the console and the console formatter, I think that makes the most sense then.
But they also add the console logger, right? It's enough to call add JSON console log formatter to get console logging with the right formatter.
Oh,
You don't
I
have
see.
to call add console in addition to that. And having the current naming makes you think that you need to call both, and you don't.
I see.
You
So
just
it
need to
should be
call
then,
add
okay,
JSON
then
console.
add simple console, add JSON console, add systemd console, then makes the most sense, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Mm-mm.
But the add console log formatter itself, that one doesn't add the actual. That one doesn't set the formatter name. So maybe
And
leave
the
that
log
one.
threshold. And the log threshold, it doesn't set the log threshold.
The what?
The property log threshold, it's called
I
log
see.
standard error threshold.
Okay, so the one that takes the formatter and so the T format and the T options should be renamed to something else then?
No,
I thought like the name.
Those stay, but I think add console log formatter for that one is fine because it's a super low level API that is never used by anyone besides people authoring extension methods that hide that method.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. So that's what I'm asking. So basically, so the first two will be add console because they already exist. Then
the third one just dies.
Yeah, the third one dies, and then we name the next two add console log formatter.
Yep.
And then the last ones are add simple console, add JSON console, add systemd console.
Yep.
All right, that makes sense to me. Yeah, the console formatter API, like the right one, is still a bit like takes a lot of options. Actually, a lot of parameters, but I also don't know what to do with that.
The right one.
Yeah. Like, I mean, if you scroll all the way, like there's quite a bit of stuff going on there, right?
The reason is ilogger.log already takes all of these arguments except for maybe the text writer.
The scope provider and the text writer.
Scope provider. And then I tried removing the scope provider, but then I think
it got hard.
Yeah.
So I guess, yeah, I mean, I don't.
Class?
What's that?
Considering how complicated the interface is, should it be an abstract class so we can add stuff to it later?
Yeah.
I mean, that one, I mean, the other option we have is instead of doing that, you could just take all the arguments and put them in a struct or something. Because the thing is, if you already take, 6 arguments, it's not unreasonable to say at some point you want a 7th or an 8th, right? And so if you basically have a method that takes parameters directly, you can't add to that, right? And an abstract base type doesn't really help you much because then the right one is virtual, and then you would add a new virtual overload, then you have to like plumb the state through somehow. So you might be better off just saying take a parameter object, and then if you want to add more state to it, well, you just add to that guy, and then everybody already gets that state.
So it could be a struct. The struct has to be generic because log is generic. That seems fine if we want to do that. Log entry.
Yeah.
As a read-only type struct.
That would work for me.
Does the writer go on it, or do you take the log entry and then the writer in the?
I wouldn't put the writer there because this sounds like something that would be reused in logging more and more by itself. Yeah, I would think about it as what if we, instead of having write of t, had a struct in the main ilogger interface.
Yeah. You still want T though, so you can avoid allocations.
Yeah.
That's one issue, but.
But what is the reason to not make it an abstract class?
No, we can.
Yes.
If you really want it, Krista.
I do.
But you have to ask nicely.
All right, David, can we have an abstract class? I really like them.
Absolutely, but it won't help anything. But as long as you agree it won't help here, we should do that.
Yeah, so to be clear, like I think to me the abstract class is kind of like orthogonal to this write concern, right? Because if you want to add one more thing to it, like an abstract base type has very similar issues where you would have to add a new write overload that is also virtual now. Everybody who overrides the old one still gets the old behavior. So plumbing new state through might not be as easy as, oh, you have a struct and you add one more property to that struct and everybody already gets that.
I agree with Imo.
And again, every time that you see a method that takes 6 arguments or 7, like it seems like a grab bag already, right?
Yeah, it's kind of over the top. Okay, so let's add a log entry struct.
Okay, let me try to.
Read only struct. That's generic. Log entry of T.
Public read only log entry
of T state.
Does it have to be prefixed with console? Probably, right?
No.
But it's going into the console ref assembly though.
Good question. Excellent question. Very good question. No.
Maybe abstractions?
I think it should go into into abstractions.
Okay.
Because I could see us using default interface methods, much to your chagrin, to add an overload of log. In theory, that basically unwraps this struct and calls the other overload. In 2027, and everyone's comfortable.
You're such an optimist, David.
What? I know.
So, I mean, why is the assembly a hard question? I mean, it would go in the same assembly wherever the interface goes, right?
Well, because we think this thing is more generic, and it could be used by the log contract itself. So in theory, we want to go close to the actual other logging stuff, and it could be used here as well, in the console-specific assembly, but it should be in the general abstractions assembly.
So what does it take then? So basically all the parameters we have: log level, category, event ID, state, exception, formatter, scope provider, and text writer, right?
Not scope. No. So it wouldn't take scope provider and text writer. Just the ones before that.
I see. And then scope provider and text writer would still be passed to it.
Yeah.
Should we put scope provider on it?
So no, in theory, this thing could either be a property or it could be DI injected, but we run into some issues because it has to be plumbed basically everywhere via the factory. So it has to come in via the factory. Then the factory passes it to the provider, to the logger. So it gets kind of odd if the factory doesn't own the providers, because you need the same instance between the. If we put it in DI, it has to be the same instance that is resolved by the factory, that is consumed by the formatter itself.
Okay, I'll take note.
Yeah, we tried plumbing it, and it just got hard.
I believe it. It was hard the first time.
So we gave up.
Okay, so at this point I made enough edits that I probably should update the thing so we can look at the same thing. Because my brain can only handle so much. Alright, so here are my edits. Hopefully this all looks familiar to people.
What is it called? Simple?
That's what
Simple console?
That's what we said, right?
Interesting. Cool.
And then we have our read-only struct with log entry.
With set fields. What kind of compiler is this?
Yeah, how does a read-only struct have setters?
Most compiler is broken.
Well, that's the other questions. Does it actually make sense as a read-only struct?
Yes.
Well, I guess, and then you would have okay, you can probably overload the constructor, right? I guess that's fair, but it's still a pain in the ass then.
I mean, a read-only struct's allowed to have settable properties. They just can't be auto properties, and they can't have side effects, like setting things.
Is this wrapping a class, and then these are just forwarding to the class?
What class? Where? What?
Is log entry of tstate wrapping something where the setters actually have some reasonable side effect?
There should be no set. It should just be a plain old data struct that can't be changed.
So
how is it initialized?
What's that?
How is it initialized?
With the constructor that Emo forgot to write down.
Yeah, Emo has a back compiler.
I'm not good at compiling in my head, apparently.
Oh, is this using the init only feature, or is it?
No, Emo forgot to add a constructor to have like passing the arguments.
I'm feeling trolled right now.
I mean, it could be init only, but
that's
I
fine.
don't have a language for that yet.
This is interesting. Log entry of T. I like it. It's not bad.
I have my moments.
Should that be passed by n because this thing is so huge? It has like a bajillion fields.
Well, if you pass in them as individual parameters or you pass them as one giant struct, doesn't make a huge difference, right?
Is that true?
If it's passed as one struct, it will be a mem copy rather than necessarily a copy of, well, actually in this case it will be a copy of each individual field because there's ref types.
Yeah, make it in, make it efficient.
Yeah, if it's in, it will at least pass a reference to the existing field in the parent struct. And since it's read only, there won't be any copies.
So wasn't there, like, I don't care one way or the other. I just, like, but last time we proposed this, somebody said there were powerful implications by making it in as well.
For big structs, it's always good, right? Like, I think the size there was some size threshold that we agreed on for when we would use in.
There's both a size threshold and a concern for if the struct is mutable. If it's mutable, then you may incur hidden copies, and if it's small enough, then you may be prohibiting an optimization where it gets passed in registers.
Aliasing or something like that.
Right.
For example, on Linux, a struct with 2 ints will be passed in 2 registers rather than being passed by reference.
Yeah. The guidelines as written don't have a struct that's bigger than 24 bytes that's public, and don't have API that's public that takes variables by in.
Oh, cool. Let's keep it then.
So then what I'm hearing is this.
Yep.
I guess
you dropped read only. You dropped read only on now.
Yeah. Copy paste.
Is the struct already bigger than 24 bytes?
Oh yeah.
Then it should be a class.
Well, this is also for the JSON APIs, which are explicitly performance oriented to avoid all allocations.
Yes.
I was about to say, Jeremy, you're not making friends here.
I'm just like, I said the rules as written are no structs bigger than 24 bytes and that are public, and no public API that takes anything by in.
But I thought they were framework
design that by in is because we say no big structs.
But they're guidelines, not rules, right?
Yeah.
That's why I'm reminding of where there was a question of like, wasn't there a problem described before? And I'm reminded of what the guidelines say.
Yes.
I own half the types that are over 20. I own half the structs that are over 24 bytes, and Jason owns the other half.
Well, once this library is finished, now you'll own 1/10 of them.
Yeah. But if it is, as a read-only struct, if we want to pass it by in, because this is once you start down the path of breaking guidelines or deciding guidelines don't apply in this situation, like in might be better, or I mean, it would be better if it's a read-only struct.
Yeah. Pass by in, right?
But if your final implementation is just going to unpack it in flat call, that's passing it as the struct anyway.
What? Say again.
Well, passing a struct and passing by flat parameter calls is exactly the same performance characteristic. Like that's how it passes structs by value. It just flat copies all the parameters.
That's entirely dependent on whether the struct is only of value types or if it contains reference types. If it's only value types, it will actually use memcopy, which might do a SIMD block copy under the covers versus an individual field copy.
Right, but it has reference type, so it
has both, right?
Should be the same as it should. If I understood when Jan explained it to me of the big rules that got dropped down to simple things in the guidelines, it was it's essentially a flat, the same as if it was expanded to individual parameters in a method call.
So just to be clear, this has both reference and value types as fields and properties.
Right.
So
it's not a blittable struct.
Right. Event ID is a struct. T-state can be a struct or int.
Right, but if it has any correct me if I'm wrong, Tanner, but if it has any reference fields, it'll be copied field by field.
The only requirement is for reference types is that the reference fields be copied field by field so the GC stays in sync. If T-state happens to be a large struct that is blittable, that will be copied by SIMD block. Likewise, if you have a large sequence of blittable fields following each other, those could be SIMD block copied. It's not required that they be individual copied.
So we should design for what's allowed, but I'm curious, what do we do today? Do we do just copy the single string field and then blit everything else?
So there's actually 3 fields that are reference types here.
Oh, but format is the exception and there's the string. Okay, so do we, if T-state was a large struct, would we blit it?
T-state, if it was a large blittable struct, would be blitted as an individual field.
I see. But what about, would we copy event ID and T-state together, or would we do those individually?
I believe we will for certain scenarios, but not this one.
But we can make that improvement in the future, though. Like we don't.
Right.
I think that's what you were saying, right, Steve? We can design for.
Yeah, we should design for like that. Right. We should design for what's allowed, rather than what we do today.
If I understood one of the Jans, I think it was Codis that I had this conversation with. Essentially, or my understanding is on Linux, we don't do anything clever at all with passing structs by value. It just expands them into fields and passes them one after another in the register allocators, at least.
It depends on the struct.
No, that's true.
The systemd ABI for certain structs allows them to be passed in multiple registers. If otherwise, it will be passed by reference if it can't fit into 2 registers, or if it's not a HVA or HFA, which gets even more complicated scenarios. Likewise, if you have more than 5 parameters on system V, anything past the 5th parameter will always be passed by reference because it won't fit into one of the available argument passing registers.
Okay.
Okay. This is just how we came up with 24 bytes. If he's like 4 ints and 2 longs are very different, and 4 ints and 8 shorts are very different, and hand wave, call it 24 bytes and move on. So
yeah, 24 is about the upper bounds of what will be acceptable. There's of course exceptions and special rules, and most of them get into numerics areas that's not applicable here.
Yeah.
All right. So then, are we happy with what we see right now?
No, I still super don't understand what. Yeah, why is there no in?
I thought I just did it in.
Oh, yeah, you did. But you undid it.
Probably
it didn't get updated. Also, I thought iConsole formatter becomes an abstract base class to make Christoph happy.
Yeah.
That is also a thing that we talked about. Yes. So then, it would be public partial class console formatter, I guess abstract class. So my first question is, should the console formatter actually extend? So where is the? I guess we don't have a public formatter for simple, right? We only have the options that are public, right? Never mind then. All right, so it is abstract. Anything else?
And you fix the in.
Yeah, I fixed the in. I've made the thing abstract. The method is public abstract virtual now.
I have to ask again, like, why is it called simple console? Like, why simple? What's simple mean? Like single line console, or is this like, why simple?
Well, that was basically what we said. Like default is bad because it kind of implies a subset, and then we basically said the only thing we can think of is simple because nobody liked text.
Okay.
Do you have better names, David?
I
TTY.
TTY. No, that's fine. I won't even try.
So by default, you get the simple console formatter, right? If you don't specify anything, you just say add console and don't configure anything. That's the one you get.
Sorry, can we go back to log entry for a second? I have a question on the in thing. So we said in for write, but what about the func?
That func is something different.
But it gets past the T state.
It does actually.
Good point.
Now we're up to creating a custom delegate type.
Well, what?
I don't. To be clear, I don't think T state should be passed as in. You've got no clue whether T state is actually a struct. You've got no clue whether it could be just be an int, in which case passing it by in is worse. It could also be a mutable struct, in which case passing by in is worse.
Right, but the argument for log entry being in was that T state could be big.
Well, it itself is also big enough that it's likely always going to be worth passing by in.
Even with all the other overhead involved here?
Well, there is no other overhead for passing by in. Log entry is so big.
I meant the overhead involved in calling console formatter.write.
Devirtualized because it'll be a base class, and all the derived version will be sealed, right? So it will be. I have no idea. I'm just making stuff up at this point.
It depends. Basically, the way it works is log entry is big enough that it will always be passed by reference anyways. If you don't pass it by in, then it will be passed by shadow copy, which basically means the JIT will create a space, copy the existing value to that new space, and then pass a reference to that new space to the new method. So passing by in, given it's a read-only struct, given that it's always going to be over 24 bytes. In this case, it's always going to be at least 32 bytes, means that it will always be beneficial to pass by in.
Okay.
Yeah, I was under the impression that the primary reason we made it in is because the size of log entry. I'm new that this is all big state. I thought that I normally assume the T state is an object. For the most common
not
case.
always. Well, most common case, yes. But we do have a few structs that we use to avoid the allocation, but there are other overheads in general.
But for the structs, like, what do you have in them? Like, I mean, they probably are not bigger than 24 bytes, right?
No, they're very small.
Yeah, in which case in is probably not.
Some have more fields.
Is there ever a scenario where T-state would be a class and just the same instance gets reused for multiple calls to the logger, or is that just too dangerous?
That is doable, but dangerous-ish. We do tell loggers that you shouldn't store T-state anywhere. That's why console turns into a string before storing it in the queue. Because if the caller does want to reuse the object, then they can.
Is it a recommendation to callers that they are free to reuse the objects if they so desire?
Yes.
Okay, so callers can actually pool them to cut down on to improve performance if they wish. Okay.
Yep.
Sorry, pool what, Levi? The T-states?
The T-states themselves, if they are large objects.
Yeah.
So that means then that T state could be passed by value and everything would be just fine because you would just pass a reusable class over and over again.
Right. I mean, that's the intent. I super hope loggers aren't storing the T state. It'd be really bad for everyone else.
I mean, what would be the point, right? Because you have to pay for the toString anyway. You might as well do it early.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess that kind of follows our guidance with things like read-only mem of char as well. Like you shouldn't really hold on to it after you return because someone could be reusing the buffer.
Yep.
Okay.
I have a less important question on abstract string name. Like, should it just be a regular property and the constructor take the name, or abstract property?
What if you want to compute a lazy name? No, I actually have no idea if that matters.
Yeah, you can't compute a lazy name, right? Because it needs to go in config. Yeah.
Also, like you have like 4 instances in the entire process, right? So.
Whoa, that's a lot.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
I mean, just in general, what do we generally?
So, I mean, making it a constructor is it kind of depends on how you want to run this, right? If you want name to always be there, making it a constructor parameter is probably slightly like it basically forces everybody to pass it in, kind of thing, right? Which is a bit annoying when you derive from the type, but it doesn't really make a huge difference.
It to be constant, which is what we want.
Is that going to be a problem with DI? I'm
Fair
not
enough.
sure.
No, so like it isn't a problem per se because you would basically force everyone to derive and not pass in the name. So you pass the name to base yourself, and then your constructor you take other arguments that aren't the name. So you're forced to specify name when you call the base, but it shouldn't affect DI. If you did want someone to make, if you want to make your own base class and then have someone provide the name, then that's the issue that they have to solve. But it shouldn't be an issue.
Yeah, I mean, I guess in that case, it probably makes more sense to actually have it a constructor parameter. Like as Pavel said, it kind of forces that it's immutable, right?
Yep.
All right.
Whatever assembly this in hasn't been nullable annotated yet, right?
Right. All of extensions is like net standard 2.0. And I just want to call out the log entry of T is going in a different ref assembly.
Right.
Like I don't know how we say that.
Yeah, so that's my general pet peeve that we have stopped paying attention to for almost all new features now. So like we need to get back into the mode where we think about the assemblies that we put stuff in. Normally we just put it, like we just broke it into different code sections and said this is assembly A, this is assembly B.
So it definitely shouldn't go in the namespace console.
We'll be logging that abstraction, right? Abstraction. Right.
Yeah, and the logging namespace.
So it should be in the same namespace as the console logger extensions?
Yep, but a different assembly.
Okay, so then...
We already have a console sub namespace in Microsoft Extensions logging?
Yes.
Yeah.
That doesn't conflict at all in normal usage with system.console?
It does.
Whoa, it does?
No, it shouldn't.
Yeah. If you're inside Microsoft Extensions logging, because now that is found as a sub namespace of your current scope better than system.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah,
so
inside it sucks,
you, if you're working on it, but not for anyone else.
Yeah, so when I use extensions, I mean like if I want to write line in the console, I have to say console.writeLine. Yeah, I mean like, you know, the system
console
it's like, yeah. So
that should only really affect you if you added the namespace, and we basically put everything for the most part in the main namespace for extension methods. So you only pull it in for options, which is a little bit unfortunate, but
well, I mean, the only people who would be affected are people who are working inside the namespace logging,
for the most part,
or in another sub namespace of logging, because then console will have a better match against the sub namespace of your or your parents' namespace than it will for system.namespace from your global using.
So it's just us, basically, like, right?
Yeah. It's just funny because this morning someone posted an issue of like, enum methods don't work anymore, and I'm like, well, you have a sub namespace in your current namespace called enum, and that's what it's finding instead of the type. And he's like, oh, language, closed issue.
All right, so which assembly is the existing console logger extension stuff in?
The console assembly.
Yes.
But the namespace is, yeah, I mean, yeah, that's right.
So this would be, what does it say? Microsoft logging extensions console. And then the log entry thingy would go in what assembly? What else is in there?
Logging abstraction.
Somebody.
What's the difference between logging abstractions and just straight up logging? Logging has implementation in it.
So let me explain the intent of these split layering things. So like originally when we were doing like assembly neutral interfaces and all this stuff, we had a split between abstractions and implementations, with the intent being that you share this package as if you want to implement logging or a provider, you would use the abstractions, and it contains abstract-based classes, interfaces, enums, everything required to implement a provider, but you don't need the implementations. And then we had an implementation in kind of we had implementation assemblies that would implement the spec, basically. So throughout our stack, there's a pattern of like abstractions and implementation assemblies.
Okay.
Very.
So like configuration has the same.
Same idea.
Hosting is the same. Yeah. Okay.
Yep.
Got it.
Yep.
All right. Happy with that?
Yes.
What's the typical expected usage of log entry? Like you pass something for all 6 arguments to the constructor?
Yeah. I think that the thing that is, you know, a null exception. Yeah.
It's us that pass it, right? Like the logging infrastructure is going to create the log entry, and then people who are making their own formatters would get it and consume it.
But how do I log? Like how would I write a basic equivalent of console.writeLine? What would I do in order to get stuff into the logging system?
In your app?
Yeah.
iLogger.log, log information, passing a string in.
And so
it's turned into a call to log with a bunch of arguments.
So I ask for an iLogger, and the logger basically is what calls into the infrastructure that constructs the log entry.
That's right.
Okay, so then in that case, I don't care.
So we expose the constructor because why not? Someone may care, but in general, we don't expect anyone other than us to use it.
Right.
Or whomever's implementing their own custom formatter.
They don't create it though. They consume it.
Well, they might do it for tests, but yeah.
Yeah, testing. Yeah, testing. Works.
Right, so then we have 5 minutes left. Is there anything else we need to do? Or should we take a look at this one, or should we postpone this one here?
One.
Oh, we have 5 minutes. We can approve it. Right?
There's add console log formatter. Like, are we still cool with the log formatter part in there?
Yeah.
This one here? Yeah, this one I thought we said is infrastructure, right? We don't expect.
Yeah.
Like, I guess
But
these guys are.
We dropped log from everywhere. It's just console formatter everywhere else.
Well, the log is gone, but we keep formatter.
Oh, yeah.
So should it be add console formatter?
That is true.
Seems fine.
That is true.
And then just to make sure on the color stuff, we're totally cool with ANSI console codes telling people if you want to make color in your formatter, write ANSI console codes, and then we'll strip them out if we need to on Windows and turn it into set foreground color, set background color.
Yeah.
Wait, we're gonna parse all the strings coming in and look for things that look like ANSI color codes.
Super easy.
Yeah, if the VT mode is not enabled on the console, yes, we will do that.
Which should only be for down level Windows. So like
That's
Windows
right.
7, Windows 8.
Yes.
Can we detect that?
Yes.
Yeah, there's an OS API you can ask. Do you support ANSI? And when that's turned on, we should just be able to forward it straight through on Windows.
Nice.
Windows
Okay,
have Windows have get console mode, which is return user mode, and you can test it. Yeah.
And I saw
Unless we say unless we
had a
say
parser.
Windows 7 and Windows 8, we just don't get color anymore.
What are we
Is
going
that
to do for like right now we disable the color APIs on Linux, for example, when you're redirected. What are we going to do in that case?
So when we talked to the terminal guys last week, the general consensus was you don't want to do that because it highly depends on other things whether it makes sense or not. So for example, when you do git log, it's redirected to less, and less still shows colors, right? So like it's basically the general pattern is if you really want to suppress the colors, like there's either like command line switches you pass to the thing or something else, but you can't make the decision necessarily in infrastructure automatically.
Okay, we added that in the first place because it was spamming people's log files and it was causing massive readability issues.
Sorry, which one?
But kind of the difference here is like this is a console logging, right? Like if you wanted to do some other kind of logging, like serial log or something, like that's a whole different formatting.
Yeah.
Right?
But people never redirect from the processes that are using this?
No, they probably do, I guess.
Yeah, that was the thing that I also asked. Like, it seems to me like that's a general problem on Linux or any system where you have effectively ANSI escapes as the only way to write color, because it's unclear to me how you would do that. But
well,
I
there's
guess
a whole issue open about this, and the fact that we lack the ability to specify from the CLI down whether like what to do about color. And I feel like before we dig ourselves a deeper hole, we need an answer for what that story is going to be.
I mean, it
But we
seems
have
to
an
me.
option. We have an options like if you don't want it, right? You can put in your configuration disable colors, and then the formatter shouldn't be writing colors anymore.
I mean, that would be my quick thing. The problem with configuration is it's not
Just to
convenient,
understand,
right?
when you say disable colors equals true, what that causes the implementation to remove any ANSI colors that were written?
Yeah. Right. The formatter, the simple console formatter, will not put ANSI colors into the.
Oh no, but what if the caller is putting in colors? There's no way you said the caller writes like the color string for red or blue or whatever.
I meant like the custom formatter. Like the whole idea with this opening up the formatter logger is that a third party can write their own formatter, and if they wanted colors in their formatting, they would write ANSI colors in.
So the caller calling ilogger.log string should not be passing in ANSI codes.
Right. No.
Yes.
Exactly.
Right. Because it could be going to Serialog or database or something like that.
Yeah.
That's correct.
Yeah, the number one goal that we had, we just didn't want to have colors being also part of the abstraction of the formatter.
Right.
Because that would make it complicated, right? So we said that the implementers basically, if they want to write colors, they would do what simple console formatter options do. They basically expose an option for that, whether they have colors or not. Maybe there's also more configuration options like what color you're using and stuff like that. And then they basically just write it formatted like ANSI escaped to the underlying logging infrastructure. And then we do nothing with it. We just output it directly to the console, unless we are running on Windows 7, in which case we filter it out.
Well, we filter it out and then change the color using APIs, or we just take them out altogether.
Yeah, that's something we can decide. I think I think I'm okay with saying you don't get colors at all. I mean, it's already hard enough.
That'll be a change.
I think for the implementation we do right now, we don't try to interpret the ANSI codes, but we do not put them in the string if you turn colors off, and then we can see if we can fit the whole like parsing the ANSI color thing, because I think that's the big piece of code to write, right? To interpret and then use the color APIs in .NET to write the string.
Today internally we have a Windows console and a non-Windows console, and then we pass the system console colors around.
Yeah.
Right, and we didn't want to expose any of that.
Yeah.
Exactly.
But then on Windows we call it the console APIs, so you will get colors today on Windows 7.
Do we have a parser that can parse BT100 or
We have-
ANSI codes.
We have to write one.
Right. So I would say like I would do that part last. Basically say like there's a regression in Windows 7 and you won't get colors, and then we try to fit that last piece in after we get this checked in the right shape.
Why?
If that is a lot of code is all.
No, I think I already
Parser
have
and
it.
all that. Oh, awesome then. Okay, cool. We're done.
No, but
I just want to make sure I understand. So if I set disable colors to true, that's controlling whether our implementation generates color codes or not. And then in our implementation of something, when on Windows 7 or 8, if that is, if somebody else has generated the color codes, we will remove them if that is true. Did I understand that correctly?
No,
What is true if we're on
so
Windows 7
I
or
think there's two sides here, right?
Sorry. If that's false, if that's false, then on Windows 7 or 8 we will strip out the one. When do we strip them out?
So basically, so if I may, when you have console formatter and then the console formatter.write, whomever is writing ilogger.log, they just the message they write doesn't include ANSI colors or anything, right? And then console formatter.write, internally what happens is that it first embeds ANSI colors and then parses them out. So that
why is the same component both adding and removing? That's what I'm not understanding.
Sorry?
It's not the same component.
Different components.
So what are the two components?
There's a consumer that kind of dequeues strings and writes to the console, and there's a producer that actually produces those strings.
Okay, and they're who's the producer in this case? Like, what class on the screen is producing that?
The formatter itself.
Anything derived from console formatter.
Right.
Okay, and what's consuming it?
The console log processor, I think.
Which is an internal thing?
Yeah, internal.
And so, but the simple console formatter options, so that controls one of the possible formatters, one of the possible producers, but not all of the possible producers. Is that the issue?
I don't really understand when we would remove myself.
So
if you're running on Windows 7 and somebody has an app that uses the simple console formatter, and they didn't set disable colored, or whichever way they disable colored is false.
If it's on.
If colors are on, yep.
Right.
So we're on Windows 7 and we told the simple console formatter, you should be producing colors. The simple console formatter is going to be injecting ANSI color codes into the string.
No, but that one we control, right?
Effectively, we have a stream of data coming between arbitrary producers and a consumer, and we're using the ANSI codes as sort of injected into the stream to tell the backend when it should be doing its color setting. If it implicitly supports those ANSI codes, then it just lets them pass through. If it doesn't, then it removes them and maybe translates them into something else.
Right.
Yep.
So, but like the thing is, like, you know, the simple console log formatter, sorry, the simple console formatter we control, correct? So like on Win 7, we're not obligated to use the ANSI escapes, right? We could literally just say, you know, if you are running on Win 7 or lower, even if you set colors to true, I'm not going to emit them because we can't filter them out yet. So we don't have to just let them through, right? So like I think
then we're regressing behavior, right? Today,
is
if
true.
you have colors turned on Windows 7, you get colors.
Right.
But that one we could also do, right? Because we control that implementation, right?
No.
Why not?
Unless we have the ANSI parsing on the back end.
This is how they're proposing doing that, Emo. They're proposing doing that by injecting the codes on the producer and stripping them out and reinterpreting them in the consumer, because it's asynchronous. It's the producer isn't able to call set color, like, you know, console.setColor right.
I see.
Reset color, because the color will be reset by the time it's processed.
Yeah. Right. So I guess the place where the formatter happens and the place where the where the actual output is being done is too far away. I guess that makes sense.
Right.
But then I would say, so like as a starting point, I think regressing on older platforms is not that insane in my opinion. Like that like, I mean, it might not be ideal, but as a starting point, that seems reasonable until we have a parser.
Okay.
And we can still say, I mean, I think to me the bigger issue with the parser is more like for other console formatters, right? If somebody has their own custom thing, either they have to do the thing that we do, or they basically just always emit NC escapes, and it's up for us to do the right thing. Which,
but isn't it the purpose of having the text writer in the right call that later in system console we would have the set background, set foreground APIs, or like?
Yes, we would have that, but the problem is like it depends on how the data is flown, right? So if the data is flown as a string, and then later on is actually output to the console, like you don't have a convenient place to replace the NC escape emitting to the, set the console color codes in Windows, right? You would have to reinterpret that data at that point.
At least that's more efficient.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, it's not going to be a string; it's going to be a buffer, right?
Yes.
Text writer is going to write to a buffer and then give that buffer to the other thread to actually write to the console. So yeah, it's just a question of, are you parsing that buffer and then stripping these out and setting the right thing?
Which, by the way, I don't think is that bad, because that's what Windows does on Windows 10 and up. Like if you actually write console to that, they do the emulation for you. So like it's not like we would be the first ones doing that.
So I prefer that. That seems easier.
Sorry, what is that?
To interpret the bytes and to set the console color, like whatever. But I don't get why we'd have to strip ever. I feel like if no one's producing it, when would you have to strip that?
Well,
sorry,
stripping you would.
Sorry, is stripping interpreting?
No, stripping would be in the case where you say globally I want to have to turn them off, right? And so like basically if let's say my fancy emoji formatter doesn't have a disable colors property, and so I always emit NC escapes, but then somebody wants to say I want to redirect this output into something readable, please strip them. I think it's not unreasonable for us to, like, if you already do the parsing, to have a global turn off all colors thing that is a command line switch or something, right?
Okay.
But the global turnoff wasn't something proposed, right? When we were talking about stripping up until now, we meant interpreting.
Yeah.
Like.
Sure. All I'm saying is that like interpreting could mean don't do anything, right? So like in that case, it's kind of part of the same. I mean, if you parse them already, all you have to do is not call the console APIs, right?
We're all on the same page here that we're not doing like a global turn off switch or anything like that.
As part of this feature you're talking about.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, I'm highlighting that there was a pretty active thread in .NET Runtime about a desire to control at the CLI level whether colors are or are not emitted.
You mean generically for any app, or specifically for ASP.NET logging?
For any app.
For any app.
I see. So that would mean that if we wanted to do something strippy, then that would not even be in the logging infrastructure. That would be literally at the low level where we actually write to the console.
Well, it depends on whether you're talking about stripping or whether you're talking about generating in the first place.
So generating what?
If we were just talking about system.console, right? System.console doesn't like on redirect doesn't just like work by writing and then stripping out the color codes. It just doesn't generate them in the first place.
Right.
So if we're just talking about system.console, there wouldn't be any stripping. It would just not generate them when it shouldn't be generating them, and it would generate them when it should.
Yeah, so there's this other problem that we have though, right? Which is like if we were to support modern colors with console, right? Meaning 255 colors, not the 16 that we have, we would basically have to have some facility that generates ANSI escapes, right? And then the problem is whatever that thing does, that at that point you no longer get stripping for free, right?
I didn't follow that. I mean, you could have a design where rather than calling console.foreground color equals old enum, you have console.set new enum, and it does whatever it needs to internally to generate the right codes or not.
Sure, but I think I guess if we were to support them, we would like to also support them in arbitrary strings as well, right? For cases like the logging infrastructure, for example, where that's the desire that we want to have.
Maybe. I'm just saying that there are multiple designs possible.
There's other consumers of this as well. Like we've talked to other teams, like PowerShell wants to start doing both emitting and parsing ANSI control.
Yeah, I guess the high level thing is like whatever we do for console is not part of this feature, and it's orthogonal, right? Like we can either do something like what Steven suggested or what I'm thinking, but like at the end of the day, it's a completely different design that it sits on top of console.
I'm saying it's not orthogonal if you end up with a global switch like that.
Then you lost me. Like, what do you mean by if you end up with a global switch like that?
The CLI adds a flag that allows you to specify whether you want color or not.
But at that point, it will be implementation details. I mean, like if we got this flag in the logger, I mean, we can handle it, right?
Well, I don't think we would ever support an arbitrary command line switch for any app, right? I think the best we would do is we would say, whatever command line parsing you do, you can accept a flag and then call a console API that says strip colors or something, right? Like, I have a hard time imagining that we would pre-process the command line before we give it to user code. That seems weird. And
right,
fragile.
I think the request was specifically about the CLI.
You mean
the
CLI?
You
mean .NET Run.
Oh, you mean .NET itself? Well, that's a different thing. Yeah,
not .NET exe, the host. Like
no,
.NET
build space run space myapp.dll.
Got it.
Dash no color.
Right. I mean that one I buy more. That's basically that's why I asked like for any console app or for ASP.NET. But what you mean is like literally for the .NET tooling CLI, right?
Yes.
And yeah, that one
because that feature exists on Rust, it exists on Go, it exists on wherever else.
Right. Yeah, that's what I meant earlier. Like it's typically that it's the user's problem to solve, right? It's you're not necessarily.
No, but in those cases, it's not the user's problem.
What do you mean?
Yeah, that would only work it would only work for developers, though, right? Like .NET Run is only for developers, so it wouldn't work when I publish my app and then give it to somebody.
Sure.
Now there would be no more dash no color.
Yeah. Well, then it ends up being an environment variable that's read by the core system.
So now that's something different than the CLI, right? Like it would be
no,
the host.
Not necessarily. Like this, my point is this whole thing needs to be designed because likely what would happen is the CLI ends up setting that environment variable or app context switch or whatever it ends up being. And that's respected by the core system. And then like my point is, my concern is we're developing like an individual component without having designed what the whole experience is. That's all I'm saying.
I 100% agree there. Like that's why this part's hard, and I wanted to talk about it.
But I expect some other people is already doing that. I mean, it doesn't have to be our libraries, but other apps or other libraries. I mean, non-Microsoft libraries is doing that. I mean, like parsing or formatting the VT100, and they will end up with the same situation anyway, right? It doesn't matter what we are going to design at the end.
Well, I guess, I mean, it depends on what you mean by this and that, right? Like, I mean, so there's this one argument here which says we have this feature here where we talk about logging in the context of ASP.NET, or I should say in the context of Microsoft extensions, and whether you can suppress colors or not, right? And then there is the orthogonal thing, which is, you know, can I turn off colors entirely for, you know, the .NET tooling experience, which would now probably require some low-level plumbing in console that this interacts with. If you assert this feature exists, then probably you would design this feature here slightly different by saying, oh, we don't actually do our own stuff, we just plug into console and do the right thing there. And I think that argument I buy. The question is, what would we do differently in this feature? Would we basically just say we don't care about colors right now? Because I don't think that's really an option because we already have colors in the system that exists today, right? So now the question is, if we make formatting optional, like how do we deal with colors? And what's the most?
The only thing we would change, it wouldn't be any API. The only thing we would change would be we wouldn't do the parsing on the back end.
But I thought that's what we already said. We don't do any parsing today. We would just regress on Win 7 and call it a day.
If we didn't do any parsing, and the formatter starts writing ANSI console codes,
yeah,
then it's just on Windows 7, you're going to get the ANSI console codes.
No, that's what I'm saying. We would just not do that, right? We would basically say in the implementation of our simple console formatter, we would say if we run on Win 10 or up, we use ANSI escape. Otherwise, we just don't emit them, no matter whether you disable colors or not.
And then any custom one if there's a custom one, we just tell you that's a bug in your stuff. You should go check to see if you're.
Yes. Because they don't exist today, right? So it's not a regression. Somebody would have to implement a new formatter and do their own NC escapes there, right? And people
The regression is our simple one won't be showing colors on Windows 7.
That's correct. That's what I said. Like I thought that's where we were leaning. Because that basically means we don't have to do any parsing today. We would just say, if Win 7 we don't emit colors, otherwise we honor the disable colors thing and emit NC escapes or not.
So what happens if somebody disables the VT mode in the console in Windows 10?
So in that case, I would say, so the way we would set, we wouldn't check for Win 7. Right? What we would check for is are the virtual terminal codes enabled for the console session you're in or not?
Okay, so it's general about you checking the mode.
So Rob, is this an okay behavior? Like, can ASP.NET accept that difference?
I don't know why we're going on about the regression in behavior, because I think Miriam said she has an implementation for parsing it already. So I think it's this. I feel like this is a moot point, this conversation. We only use like 4 codes right now: background and foreground color, set, reset. So I think at least to functionally support our current behavior is straightforward.
The question is like, are you parsing everything or just parsing for these colors only? I mean, this would be the question I raise. Because like VT support many things, it's not just colors or something, right?
So yeah, I get that. I think it's to get to parity with what we had thus far, that what our formatters do is pretty straightforward. Supporting the entire extended VT control codes may be a bit of a challenge.
Yeah, I mean, like the good news is VT really isn't a super well-defined thing, right? It's this loosely defined spec that people adhere to, right? But in that sense, it's always somewhat hand-wavy. And if you say we only do background and foreground colors, I don't think that's entirely unreasonable. Like my bigger concern with these kind of things is that we have a prototyping implementation, but like how hardened is that? Like, are we sure that it performs well? Are we sure that we don't accidentally have issues where we parse incorrectly and then output garbage? Like, are we willing to put up that stuff on our implementation for what amounts to basically supporting people on all the operating systems? Like, it seems like we go out of our way to make the experience good there, which is generally not what we do, right? Like, it's not that we specifically went out of our way to enable colors for Win 7. We just got it for free by implementation, happenstance, right? And all the implementation changes, and now it's actually a cost to maintain. So that's why I personally think it's a starting point to say we don't give you colors on Win 7. Like, if you want to have the best experience, you have to be on the latest operating system. And if somebody complains, we can then, do the proper thing. But, as Tarek said, the proper thing will probably be more than just foreground and background colors, right? And then we wouldn't actually design the end-to-end for that.
But as long as it supports what we have, like our existing behavior. Let's imagine we can keep our existing behavior, and yes, if you're doing other things, maybe then with a custom formatter, then maybe junk gets printed to the console on Windows 7. That doesn't seem terrible, right? Like you could never do this before, and so it's not like we're taking away behavior.
For the very least, the parser would just parse the background, foreground, the ones that it already supported. Before this change, and then reset color, and that's it. And then it would skip any other ANSI code. Any other VT code.
So let me would only kick in if you were running on Windows 7 or Windows 8.
Exactly.
Or you turned it off. If you're on Windows 10 and
you turn off VT.
Right.
Yeah.
Sorry, no, I didn't. If you turned off the OS setting.
Correct.
So we should verify this. My understanding is if you're on Win 10 that had support for VT code, you don't have to do that because they do that for you.
Correct. I've verified it myself. I'm on Windows 10. I just started outputting ANSI codes, and in old school CMD, it's like, here's some colors for you.
Yeah, so they do the translation basically, right? So that means basically the parser is only kicking out for older platforms, which seems fine. Like, let me put it this way. Like, I personally don't care so much. I would not go to my to turn it off either, but I was just pointing out that there is an extra cost that we take on, and generally speaking, whenever we talk about parsing, that is not super trivial to get right? And like, usually we want to bake these things And all I'm asking is like, are we willing to take this on? Like, if the engineering team feels happy about the implementation they have, and we are thinking it's rock solid enough to ship it, then yeah, I would not go out of my way to kill it, right? I would not just jump to the conclusion that we need to have it because we happen to have colors before.
It feels like Sarab's got a different opinion. Is that true, Sarab, or do you agree?
I mean, I think I'd say this is a engineering concern. Like I have the same opinion as Emo. It depends on what the cost is and whether the engineering team is okay supporting this going forward. Maybe my misunderstanding was supporting the subset of functionality should be like that we have already today should be straightforward, and I would push for that. But it comes down to whether you guys want to maintain the code for this.
Yeah, what I'm hearing is engineering seems to be happy with it, in which case, yeah, I would not go out of my way to remove the code. That would be backwards too.
Yeah, the other thing also I'm expecting later, I mean sooner or later, we are going to have some APIs for parsing and formatting VT100. So at that time, we can just switch calling these APIs and there will not be any cost in the future.
Right.
Yeah.
Steve.
By the way, sorry, there is another option outside of parsing the buffers. You can sneak in a custom text writer implementation that's internal and only our simple formatter knows about, and you can still use the old set colors method on it. If we only want to fix the simple formatter, we can make an internal thing for it to work. That would be entirely contained in the console assembly.
That's just a question of where the parser lives, right?
But there is no need to have a parser. Imagine you had internal console text writer that had set foreground color and set background color.
Yeah, I think that's the problem that we talked about earlier, is that the problem is that at the point where you call the text writer, you're not physically attached to the console because it goes in some queue, and then that queue actually later on puts it to the console. So basically, the people producing it can't set colors yet. But we own both sides, right? For the simple formatter, we own both the producer and consumer. So we can have an internal text writer implementation that they both know about, and like we sneak.
That's what is happening inside in the implementation.
I see. So we're not.
Oh, you're just saying rather than using ANSI escape codes as tokens, use something else as tokens.
Even that could work.
No, just call like add more APIs to the text writer. That would. Yeah, but I guess the problem is
you would have to store information. Though.
Yeah, you have a sink, more. Right? Where you store data in a queue. And we already have it. Like console logger current implementation have the queue like that stores colors and stuff. Oh, interesting. And like, how do you store it then? Like you store it as a literally embedded in the string. Like spans of text with the foreground and background.
It's an internal.
I see. It's an internal implementation.
I
guess that's fair too. Yeah.
We did want public before, and why we moved to text writer.
Exactly. We had that in the previous review.
Yeah, I guess that one is something that we can do though, right? Because as Pravel said, like if you already have an implementation that basically buffers that, then it's just basically a private handshake between implementation of the simple console formatter and the backend. And given that we control both ends, that does not seem completely insane, right? Like it doesn't have to be part of the public API because they can trivially downcast the text writer to, our internal text writer with awareness or whatever, right? And that's just an internal implementation detail. It doesn't have to be part of the public API.
Maybe we're in implementation detail territory now, but maybe I'm misunderstanding. My understanding was the reason that things were being proposed the way they were was because we wanted a single, basically byte stream handoff between the producers and consumers. If I'm understanding correctly, this would add a dedicated second one. Is that true?
So my understanding was that basically we said we want to use ANSI escapes to avoid the problem that the formatters have to somehow take spans in order to format colors at all. We basically said like, no, it's the contract between the formatters is just a text writer, and if they want to have colors in, they do that.
So that becomes the one communication mechanism. What I thought Pavel was suggesting was, in addition to that mechanism, you have a second dedicated one for the legacy, or for the simple console, which still uses spans and colors attached to it.
Right, but my understanding was what he meant was the implementation, because we currently have that implementation already. Apparently, that's how the current system works.
I'm saying that what he's suggesting is basically for all of the new stuff, you have the new scheme. For the old thing, you have the old scheme. So now you have 2 instead of 1.
Yes.
No, but it all flows into the true, but it all flows into the old scheme-based sync in the end.
Well, it wouldn't, right? Like, because we wouldn't parse the output from the new system and then create spans out of that. We would just win around to them as text.
Yeah, so for new stuff, you just use a regular text writer. For old stuff, we use the existing implementation.
But there's one consumer or 2 consumers?
There are 2 different consumers, right? There is a
right. So that
one consumer is an
that's what I'm saying. So like the suggestion is to have 2 consumers instead of 1.
I think if it's implementation detail, I can share after the call, as so long as it doesn't affect the API proposed, right?
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's more like that's why I was asking earlier, like, would the API change in any meaningful way here? Like, it seems we will still support the existing mechanism, which had a way to disable colors. And currently, we only have colors effectively in one place. And the only thing that we change here is basically to say, if the JSON console formatter or any other formatters want to emit colors, they do so by embedding NC escapes.
How about to simplify it, and rather than having a disable colors property on simple console formatter options, that would remain on console logger options. So if disable colors is false, then we kind of regress, whatever. I mean, not necessarily regress, it's just if it's disabled, then no parsing happens anyways.
I have a Unix question that does potentially impact the API, or maybe it won't. So system.console goes out of its way to use whatever ANSI escape codes the current terminal says are the right ones to use. So it parses the term info file for the current terminal and uses that language to compute the right strings to output for given colors. This isn't going to do that, presumably. Does every terminal also respect whatever ANSI escape codes this is going to use?
So I don't know enough about so what does the term info struct tell you? Like, how would they how do the escape codes for foreground color differ?
It tells you, it gives you basically, it uses this kind of language where it basically specifies a string and you give it the color value and it computes the ANSI escape code to be used for that terminal.
Interesting. So my understanding, and I mean, I could be wrong, but by what I've heard so far is that they are standardized for, this color code is this sequence. I wasn't aware that they would differ between different implementations of the terminal.
My understanding, VT100 is a minimum. I mean, like minimum set that it's supported across the board. And what Stephen is talking about, I think it's something like you can enhance that if you want to support like 24-bit colors or something like this. So this is my understanding. We can confirm that. I mean, like, whatever. I mean, like the simplest case for VT100 for foreground background colors is always supported.
Today, when you're not on Windows, it just hard codes escape 40M, 41M, whatever.
Right. And I guess I just want to make sure that we're not going to end up on certain terminals, and maybe it's a legacy concern. Maybe it doesn't matter with any terminal that anyone actually uses. I just want to make sure we're not going to spam it with control codes it doesn't understand.
If we did, we would be doing that today. So
Sure.
it would
Yep.
existing behavior.
Yeah. I mean, so the other question I have is, so like echoing what Mariam proposed, or what I thought she proposed, what if we move the disable colors to the console formatter options base type and allow any formatter to honor that? So that if I write my own JSON console formatter that is colors, I can just query the property that is part of my own custom struct or my own custom class, and then we can say like everybody should basically check this thing to emit colors, and we would basically say like, yeah, if somebody wants to turn them off, that's how you would turn them off for everybody. There's always a disable colors property on every every formatter.
So the only weird thing about that is today formatters don't need to consume console logger options. Like we do it for our stuff to preserve backcompat, but if I was writing a new formatter, I wouldn't consume console logger options. And this is now like.
No, I'm not saying console logger options. I'm saying
No, I think he
formatter
meant
options.
the console formatter
options.
So we have so on our simple one we have disable colors, right? And I'm basically asking. Right. Should we just move this property to the base type, to this guy here, so that every formatter always has a way to suppress colors?
Oh.
Even the other two that we have that don't do colors?
Yeah, like the JSON one, right?
So it's basically, in effect, trying to say skip parsing, right?
Well, basically what it says that, yeah, don't put them in the first place, right?
Yeah, no, skip parsing and don't even, encode them. Embed them.
But if we have a skip parsing, means that if it is false, so this means that we are going to parse all the time?
Well, I mean, that could be a configuration option somewhere else, right? Whether we do the stripping this way or not, right? I guess in a perfect world, we wouldn't just always run the stripper, right? That would be pretty basic.
I prefer to have the colors in the names. I mean, because we are talking about colors only here. I mean, like, if we are talking about escape, so it will be more than that. I mean, it's not just colors. So we have to be specific about what we are going to parse or format.
Yeah, I guess my general assumption is that like a formatter would not put an arbitrary ANSI escapes, right? Like, move caret left, move caret up. That seems pretty useless in a formatter, right? What you would normally do is like colors and formatting, like the bold, italics, underline, whatever they support in VT, right? But that's kind of the extent to which you would expect a formatter to use ANSI escapes, right? Like, what else would you do? Like,
so if I am running on Windows 10 and I'm sure that I'm running on Windows 10 and I can put anything in the stream, it doesn't have to be just colors, and I will be pretty sure that this will be rendered correctly. So because it's not good parsed, so I don't know about like what people is going to do. I mean, in general, about why producing this text writer. I mean, with the codes inside.
Yeah, I guess my imagination isn't strong enough. But like, what besides colors and like bold, underline, italics, what else would you put in there? Like, would you move the cursor? Like, that seems.
There is something for the font, for example. I believe so. There is some other controls. I mean, like, it's not for the colors, but. I don't remember exactly the details now, but there is more than the colors.
Okay.
I think the only thing I can think of is like line feeds and move cursors.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. And that seems generally in interactive mode sensible, but it doesn't make a lot of sense when you effectively produce the log asynchronously and then output it later. But that seems fairly weird to do these things.
But the premise of this question is, are you unhappy with the name like color?
Yeah, I think what he's saying is more like, disable ANSI escapes or something like that, right?
My vote here would be to keep like disable colors, because it captures like 90-something% of the use case.
I agree.
So then it would be just an extra thing that says disable, what's it called, like skip parser or something? It would be something on its own, not related to disable.
No, I think we're proposing not having like skip parsing. Just use disable colors is the option.
Okay.
Well, I guess, yeah. I mean, to me, skip parsing is kind of like you control what happens at the base. Here, basically, what we are proposing is you change what people put into the pipe, right? So instead of us parsing them out, you basically tell everybody don't put them in the first place. If you do, it's a bug on your end.
Right.
Which I think is fair, right? I mean, like, it seems generally bad to do work and then, us being on the hook to remove it later, right? That seems weird.
We can turn it off in ours. It's right.
Well, which is basically what we currently have. Right? We basically have disabled colors only in ours, and the question is, should we just make this a general purpose feature so anybody could do that?
I mean, the simple answer is we have 3 reference implementations of formatters, and only 1 out of 3 uses them.
Yeah.
So it doesn't make a good case to go into the base.
Well, I mean, my question is why does the JSON console formatter not use colors? It seems like when you emit JSON, it would be not insane to actually have that render nicely on the screen, no? Like, I mean, maybe we don't do the work now, but I mean, that seems like a fairly reasonable feature request that we would like to do eventually.
Okay.
Or am I making things up now?
So I think I'm extrapolating a little bit here, but the primary use for colors is when people look at the console. Like both with JSON and systemd, they aren't meant to be human readable formats. They're meant to be machine readable formats, so that you plug them into some other logging system. So colors are usually not that valuable there.
Fair enough. I guess the downside is if you put it in the base, then the worst that can happen is it doesn't apply, but everybody would use the same property physically, right? If you don't put it in the base, then we basically ask everybody who does colors just follow the pattern, right? Which is not bad, but it's just that's kind of what happens, right? And people will probably not do that, be my guess.
I don't have a strong opinion on this. I'll defer to hear on what precedent is.
Yeah, but I do get a sense that we may be over-engineering at this point. Like, it seems like what we currently have on screen basically captures what we need to ship, and then everything else is kind of speculation on our end.
So it's good to go?
I'm personally fine with it. I think we have enough of the discussion happening with colors that I think we clarified the behavior that we want. And so my understanding of the behavior that we want is that we will basically say, we will, on our end, either use the parser that you currently have on Win7, or we would just tell people to disable colors by default, or we will do it manually, right? But these are the two options that we have, and it's kind of up for the engineering team to decide whether you're happy with the strip that you have for Win7. And if you feel like you're happy with that, then it's okay to say, yep, the only thing you handle is what we currently put in from our end, which is foreground and background color, and that's the only thing we handle.
Sounds good.
So out of the box on Win7, simple console formatter that's printing out colors. Do I see colors on the screen?
As it stands right now, yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah, we shouldn't break the compatibility, I believe.
Okay.
I should add one thing. The reason I'm a little worried, because I don't think it's just Windows 7. There are a lot of places where there are embedded consoles that I don't know the behavior of, like the output window in VS, or the F5 window VS launches the embedded console in VS Code. I'd be worried if all those common targets actually support ANSI consoles, which is why I'm hesitant to lose the functionality.
So my understanding from talking to what's his name, Rich, was that the only other implementation that we have of the terminal is VS Code, because in VS the terminal implementation is baked by the actual terminal that we have in Windows.
Okay,
and so that should support that already. So then the only other thing is the VS Code one, and he said they basically support NCSKs because that's kind of the only thing that makes sense for them. So I think it really boils down to CMD and CMD effectively on Windows.
Okay.
So I take back what I said before. You have to put a registry setting for CMD to print out colors from ANSI codes. If you
don't set that, it just outputs them as
ANSI
garbage text.
Yeah, you see arrow open bracket 31M.
So
I guess that seals it for us.
So sorry, which operating system are you on? You're on Win7?
I'm on latest Windows 10. My WinVer says Windows 10 OS build 19041.
Yes, but because you have to set you have to basically call the Windows API that enables VT100, right? In the process.
I
No.
The owner of the console said that it's turned on by default, I believe, on Windows 10. This mode.
Okay. Maybe it was just because I upgraded from before and not a brand new install, I guess, but it wasn't on my machine. I had to enable a registry setting.
Yeah, so my understanding is the registry setting basically controls what the default is for processes you spin up in CMD. But like if like in the process in that you basically can set the set terminal mode or whatever, and you can set terminal VT100 or enabled or something, right? And if you set this in CMD, it should do the right thing. And my understanding was that.
Do that?
Sorry, what? Who's going to do that?
We would tell the user to do that as well.
Well, I mean, we control the process, right? We would call that.
When?
Why?
Yeah.
Well, part of the initialization of the logging infrastructure would do that.
I thought you would set it when you launch the terminal itself.
Yeah. No, so terminal mode is called by the app. It's not called by the operating system. Like you are supposed to call that if you want to enable it. Like it's basically the app that decides that.
But should we take this decision on behalf of the users? I mean, like, I don't think this is wise to do. I mean, like, it's up to the user to turn it on or off, but not for us, I mean, to force the direction for them. Yeah, I mean, like, the best we can do is just we can check the mode.
Well, I mean, like, so to give some context, right? If you launch a process in the new terminal today on Windows 10, they will set the mode by default already.
That's right, yeah.
So like the question is, if your process now gets launched in CMD, I don't think it's unreasonable if we set it by default in modern.NET. And then if you don't want this, we give you an opt-out from doing that. But it seems like why would you not want to do that? Like realistically, what I understood from Rich is the only kind of applications that don't want to have that are some sort of legacy applications that have some weird legacy behavior where the output of the console is parsed by some crazy, thing that is super sensitive for stuff. And that's generally not the case. Right?
If an app sets it, is it automatically undone when that app goes away?
Well, it's basically a setting just for your own app. It does nothing to do with the process.
I don't understand. It's not configuring.
It's basically a setting for. It's basically a process level setting, right? So if your process dies, you didn't do anything to the terminal. It's just a setting of your own app.
I see.
So then, even if I have the registry setting saying I don't want this, we would automatically just overwrite it and say, nope, you want this.
Well, the setting doesn't disable it, right? The setting is basically controlling what you get by default. That's my understanding, right? It's not a disable this behavior. It's kind of like in CMD, is this mode on by default and if the setting is absent, then it's not on by default, right?
Okay. So I think this is not a logging question. I think this is a higher level.
I would agree with that, but like it's basically like the question is if you build a modern app, like what should be same default, right?
Does the registry key default to off?
Yeah, if it's not there.
Yes.
On my machine, if it's not there, you get the ANSI console code printed out, not the color.
And if they add a key there, can they set it to off explicitly in a way that we could check?
Can I suggest that someone just follows up with Windows to find out exactly what behavior?
That's something like we should talk to the terminal guys, because based on what they said us last time, like basically the recommendation is you should do it by default. The only reason they don't do it in Windows is because they break super old apps, which I don't think applies to us.
I agree with Emo. I think it's okay to have an opinion here. We should turn it on.
Looking at the docs for set console mode, it is sticky though. It's not tied to your process lifetime.
So you're saying you're literally changing what the process, like the terminal itself?
Yeah. It's just like setting a color. Like a color will persist after your application has gone away, right? Like if you change the foreground color, you're stuck with it.
Okay, maybe I'm wrong, but my understanding was that, so let's say one process launches in CMD, sets this terminal mode, and then adds exits, and the next process starts. I don't think that flag is on for the next process, but you're saying it is?
That's what my reading of it is. I could be wrong now. I will take it as an action item to follow up.
Okay.
And then we'll enable if it's kosher. Let's say that's the conclusion.
Yeah. So just to be clear, like the terminal already in Windows has that opinion, right? If you launch anything from the new WT terminal, it's on by default for every process. So like it's only when you launch a process in CMD where that's actually kicking in. So like that's why basically by Rich said you should turn it on, because the only case where you want to run an existing app in that environment is because, well, this is some sort of like AS400 interrupt thingy that just doesn't work otherwise. But like, that's generally not the case for any app written in the last 15 years. So like, that's why I think the idea is we should probably take an opinion here and just make that the default.
Yeah, I agree if we provide also a config switch with it. I mean, just by default, we set the mode ourselves. And if somebody doesn't like this behavior, so they can turn to it.
Yeah, I mean, like, that's something we should probably talk to the Windows guys. My understanding was that the desire or the need for this should be so low that it might not even be worth it. Like, for example, in Windows Terminal, I don't think you get to turn it off ever. Like, Windows Terminal only works this way. So that's why I'm not sure that we need to support that either. So anyway, but like, that's probably something orthogonal that we should follow up with. So like, who's taking point on that? Is it Miriam? Sharab? Okay. You have all the contacts, right?
Yeah.
Cool. All right. Anything else then, or can we just say this is the API we have?
Yes.
We can disable colors down on simple, right?
So, okay, can somebody summarize now what behavior we agreed on? So that.
I mean, do we have what's on the screen?
Yes, that's my understanding, right?
Okay, so disable colors stays on simple formatter.
Yes.
And then, so the API is what's on the screen, and from an implementation side, we'll enable VT parsing on the Windows terminal, assuming the Windows team like recommends it, and there are no other side effects.
I think we do the parsing only if we are not running on the VT mode in the console. That's it, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So my understanding is from talking to Rich is if you're on Win 10 and you basically don't have the terminal emulation enabled, they will filter out the codes and set the colors through the old system. And everything else they basically drop on the floor.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's kind of two decisions. One is in the console logging, when the terminal isn't set to parse ANSI, we'll do the parsing of ANSI and change the colors. And then there's an orthogonal question of whether we just turn that on by default on brand new .NET 5 apps.
Yeah, so like that's maybe where I misspoke. I think my understanding from Rich was if you're on Win 10, you should never do any parsing yourself because even if it's off, they do it for you. So the only area where you would have to do any parsing yourself because the terminal can't handle VT100 is basically Win 8 or lower or something, right?
So what you said before is not true. Like on my machine, I have it turned off. I run a console. It shows me the ANSI control colors in CMD.
Yeah,
I
this
see.
is what
Okay.
we need to clarify with Windows team. I mean,
Yeah.
like what is the behavior? I mean, what is the default behavior when the VT mode is enabled and disabled?
Okay, then let's basically make it maybe the other way around. So what behavior do we want? Because the behavior we want, I think what I heard was on Win 7, you get colors. You don't get ANSI code spilled to the console, right?
Right.
Correct.
So
and then on Win 10, when your terminal ANSI is turned off, you still get colors, right?
Yes.
Because that's what you got before.
The only question is an implementation side on Win 10, whether we use the same Windows 7 path or we set the console mode and use the ANSI code.
Yeah, I think that'll be an implementation detail. This is behavior. What behavior do we want?
Yeah.
The behavior is
Windows 10
color
is turned off. Somehow somebody turned it off. We still get colors.
Right. We should.
Okay. And then there's an orthogonal question of should .NET 5 EXEs just enable it by default?
Yeah.
So what was the last one?
Should .NET 5, when you run an EXE, should it turn on terminal parse ANSI by default? And then that's a follow-up question for the Windows team on like, is it sticky past your process? etc.
Yep.
This change should be on the level of the console, our console itself, or should be in the logging only?
It wouldn't be. I don't think that's a logging decision. I think that should be an all up. Like if you run a .NET 5 app, should it turn it on or not? So even if I'm not using extensions logging, if I start stuffing ANSI console codes to the console, should it start turning into colors?
Okay, so yeah, we should turn it on the level of the console itself, right? Okay.
The console or the host or somewhere that's not Microsoft extensions, somewhere lower.
Yes, that's.
If we're going to do it, it should be for everywhere.
Yeah. Sounds good.
All right, so basically the 4 things is then we said implementers of iConsole formatter should use VT100 for color decisions. On Win 7, we still want to show colors, not VT100 escape sequences. On Windows 10 Plus, we want to see colors, not VT100 escape sequences, even if VT100 processing is off. And then there's the last one, which is should .NET 5 by default enable VT100 processing. All right, so I think that captures everything we said then.
Okay.
And then I can mark this API finally as approved.
Yeah. Just add, if there's a decision made that .NET 5 should set that mode, I think that goes beyond this library. Like that needs to be done at the console.
Yeah, that's what I was saying.
So who takes point for making a separate issue for that?
I'll file a separate issue and then I'll capture something in the .NET Designs repo.
Sorry, what is your GitHub user account?
SHIRHATTI.
SHI.
R.
Oh, here we go. Yeah, here we go.
Yeah.
Perfect. All right, and I think we're good to go for today.
Emma, when we review all the other things.
Sorry, what are the other things?
Yeah, the item, it was in this agenda today, but it's...
Oh, the improve activity API? So like, yeah, I will file a separate thing for this one here.
I have in my calendar, there is a design review at 3 o'clock today.
There is one, but that's for networking. Sorry, for GPRC. Like the reason I set it up for the afternoon was because of James Newton King, because he lives in New Zealand.
Yeah. So, sounds okay.
So I don't think we'll have time for this one.
I will follow up with you offline. About that. Okay.
Yes, and tomorrow is off, so it will be next week regardless.
Yeah, sure.
Alrighty. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Thanks,
Bye.